Chapter 725. After the group entered the forest, the blue light curtain slowly closed behind them, as if it had a life of its own. They soon found that the inside and outside of the light curtain were two completely different worlds. It was still afternoon outside, but it was already dusk inside the light curtain. There seemed to be a blue curtain hanging in the sky, and there were a few stars hanging in the distance, like the scenery after dusk. And 100 steps away, the woodland was gloomy. The huge contrast made everyone vigilant. Maynard and Freya gently pulled out their long swords and looked around. There seemed to be some kind of uneasiness lurking in the air, sending chills down their spines. Brando looked at the strange shadows in the woodland. They were already in a valley, and the hills in the distance were immersed in the night. In the north, the sky was dark purple like the silent night. This hill was called the Twilight Hill, in the Amber Sword, and in his memory, it should be the southwest corner of Milo's breath. At the entrance of this area, there should be a lair of dusk hounds, an ancient subspecies of canine devil beast. It had long been extinct and wound, but there were still a few in some black forests. "My lord, as you said, which direction should we go now?" Lorena asked, interrupting his thoughts. The guide mentioned that there should be a path leading to the atrium. Here, Brando silently recalled the text on the guide. The Twilight Hill is the best entrance to Milo's breath. The lair guarding the gate is a devil beast called Duskhound. The passage through the Duskhound's lair extends north to the atrium. There is a treasure location at Point A and Point B, and these two locations were explored by the Crimson Wing Brigade and the Crystal Apple Guild in 385 and 387 respectively. If this was the first time this dungeon had been explored, then the treasure location mentioned in the guide might still exist. His gaze searched the forest for a moment, and he suddenly realized that this endless valley was actually a passageway. Brando's gaze extended forward, and the dark green hills on both sides meandered to the north, which was also consistent with the description in the guide. After confirming this, Brando had a plan. "Let's move along this valley. Be careful of the demonic spirits on the way. Try not to use magic or activate magic tools. Use open flames for illumination. Use of illuminating crystals is prohibited." Although demonic spirits were not difficult creatures to deal with, once the battle started, the dissipation of mana would attract more demonic spirits. Some players once said that the demonic spirit was the alarm in the Milo's Breath dungeon, and it wasn't baseless. "Do you understand?" "Understood." Everyone nodded. Brando was somewhat satisfied, although his understanding of this dungeon was only limited to the guide. But he knew that in an unknown environment, people were always willing to believe people who seemed to have a card up their sleeve. As the most experienced person in the team, he naturally had to take up this responsibility. He continued to order, "Scarlet, Medisha, you two lead the way. Ms. Lorena, please bring up the rear." "Yes, my lord." Medisha nodded on behalf of Scarlet. "No problem." Lorena also raised her sheathed sword and placed it on her chest. This was a cruise knight salute. It meant that she was willing to accept orders. Since no one had any objections, the team was quickly divided. Scarlet and Medisha walked at the front as the eyes of the team. Both of them held spears as they walked through the dense coniferous forest. They soon noticed that as the team went deeper, the sky through the gaps between the layers of branches was getting darker and darker. From the light red of the evening at the beginning, it became light blue, and then dark blue. Gradually, it was full of stars and became a scene of silence. It was as if they had only walked in the forest for 10 minutes, and the sky had turned from evening to late night. In fact, this was the characteristic of the Dusk Hill. This was the transition area of the Evernight Forest. It was not until they went deep into this area that they truly entered the heart of the forest. The surroundings gradually became dark, but Scarlet lit a torch, and the flames extended in all directions, casting long shadows of the surrounding dense cedar trunks in the woodland. However, where the light could not reach, the darkness seemed even deeper. The team advanced for about half an hour, and Medisha suddenly noticed that specks of light began to appear in the deep darkness. She immediately recognized that they were the demonic spirits floating between the woodland. She pulled Scarlet and raised her finger to make a "be careful" gesture to her. "What is that?" Scarlet also noticed the specks of light in the forest and asked in a low voice. "It might be demonic spirits." "So many." Scarlet was shocked. In her opinion, there were indeed too many of them. There were at least 100 of them. She looked at the floating spirits and seemed a little nervous for a moment. "Don't worry," Medisha said softly, "although the demonic spirits are scary, they are notoriously blind. As long as they don't use magic, light is invisible to them. As long as we pay attention, there shouldn't be a problem." Scarlet nodded doubtfully. In fact, Brando wanted to use Medisha as the team's informant because of her rich combat experience and the innate sensitivity of an elf. Brando arranged for Scarlet to be his partner to protect the former. After he became an official planeswalker, Medisha's level and the Shire's level were downgraded together. Although they could level up through gaining experience like him, it had been less than a month since Brando arranged for Scarlet to be his partner. Because planeswalker creatures had the flaw of not being able to be resurrected, Brando had to be careful. Scarlet looked in that direction again, and when she turned back, there was some doubt in her eyes, as if to say, "What do we do now, Medisha?" The Silver Elf Princess understood and whispered, "Scarlet, see if you can go around the left and right sides." Scarlet was slightly startled and looked at her suspiciously. In theory, although Medisha's strength was a level lower than hers, it was not to the extent that she could not see clearly from such a distance. But as if sensing the Highlander's suspicion, Medisha hurriedly explained, "This place seems to have some kind of restriction on us heroic spirits." After saying that, she blushed a little. If not for the fact that her level was downgraded too hard to explain, she was really not good at lying. But to be honest, even now she did not understand what this level was, and why it was related to her strength. Fortunately, under the light of the fire, Scarlet did not see the slightest blush. She nodded and turned back, but her eyes swept across the valley, and found that the demonic spirits in the forest seemed to have blocked all the paths ahead. After looking carefully for a while, she shook her head slightly. "Can't I?" Medisha pondered for a moment, and immediately opened the telepathic link, and sent a message to Brando behind her. Not long after, the bushes behind the two girls rustled, and Brando and the others came out from there. "Medisha, Scarlet." After getting the news from Medisha, Brando roughly guessed what was going on. He walked out of the forest behind the bushes, looked up, and saw the specks of light in the darkness. The Evernight Forest was a huge area, and the distribution of monsters in this area was very random, but after the players' exploration, they had found many patterns. Before this, the path that he had pointed out for Medisha and Scarlet was actually a very remote path, and according to the guide, it could avoid most unnecessary battles. Since they had wasted a lot of time in the Ansera forest, Brando had to choose this path. But this path was not without worries, and there were also two monster nodes that could not be bypassed in the path they had to pass through. One of them was a place called the Demonic Pool, and the other was the last pass before the atrium, where they had to face the Duskhounds and the Hicks. Brando glanced at the amazing number of demonic spirits in the forest, and roughly determined the location of this place, the Demonic Pool. Although it was not the lair of the demonic spirits, in some ways, it was actually more like a lair. Demonic spirits in The Amber Sword were genuine gold-tier monsters, and normally speaking, to kill so many of them, it would take at least 2 teams of players to think about it. However, Brando just happened to know an unusual way to deal with these demonic spirits, and in this kind of dungeon that had been thoroughly understood by players in the later stages of the game, there were too many strange strategies. But he glanced over there, and then looked away. Before he was ready to pass through here, he still had 2 things to do. Brando judged the direction and glanced at a place in the darkness, where he saw a huge cedar tree that needed 2 or 3 people to encircle. "Medisha, how tall are you?" he whispered. The Silver Fairy Princess was slightly taken aback, not expecting her lord to ask such a strange question. She hesitated for a moment, and then somewhat embarrassedly told Brando the answer in the telepathic connection. Even so, she still heard the Shire chuckling on the side. Brando glared fiercely at that side, and then he said, "About right, come to my side." Medisha was a little puzzled, but did as she was told. No one understood what Brando was doing at all, and could only watch in confusion as the Silver Fairy Princess walked to Brando's side with some curiosity. "Lord, what are your orders?" "Now you're facing me," Brando said, looking at the cedar tree. "Brando, what are you doing?" Freya was a little puzzled, and in fact, everyone was as puzzled as she was. If she hadn't asked, Faraz, who was eagerly behind her, would have already spoken. "You'll know in a moment," Brando replied. Medisha hesitated for a moment before continuing to take a step closer. She was now almost face to face with Brando, and could even feel the faint aura coming from his lord. She blushed. Ever since she was summoned by Brando, she had never been so close to her master at such an ambiguous distance. But Brando was still not satisfied, and he pressed down on her shoulder and adjusted her direction. Medisha was startled, and the tip of her nose touched Brando's chest several times. "Brando!" Freya glared at Brando, and if it weren't for the fact that the enemy was nearby, she would have stabbed him with her sword. But Brando acted as if he didn't hear her, and only at this moment, he felt as if he had returned to the time in the game, when he was exploring dungeons with trusted companions. He stared at the huge cedar and whispered to Medisha. "Now, you start from my side, step back 10 steps, and then tell me what you feel." Brando's words sounded a bit like a riddle, but Medisha's trust in him had long reached the point where she could do anything without asking for the reason. She was only slightly startled, then nodded and slowly stepped back. Everyone saw her step back 10 steps and then stop. "Tell me, what do you feel under your feet?" Brando asked. Medisha's eyes lit up slightly, looking very strange. "I feel a faint magic power, like a magic mark." "My lord, how do you know there's something here?" But Brando obviously didn't intend to answer her question for the time being. He took the torch from Scarlet's hand and shone it at Medisha. The fire immediately imprinted the Silver Fairy Princess's shadow on the ground, and the others followed Brando's gaze and were stunned. Because they saw that the shadow behind Medisha clearly had a pair of translucent wings. "This is..." Filas couldn't help but be a little flabbergasted. But Brando secretly exclaimed in his heart, "Just as I thought." Of all the people, only Lorena was keenly aware of the change in his expression, and the female knight immediately asked, "Mr. Count, do you know something?" Brando breathed a sigh of relief, then nodded and replied, "Demonic spirits don't gather in a certain place for no reason, and the origin of this place actually has a little bit to do with the Black Tower Wizards of Karsuk." Black Tower Wizards. This time even the Shire was slightly taken aback, knowing that he used to be a member of the Black Tower Wizards. Brando smiled slightly, and this time he wasn't lying, it could only be said to be a coincidence. The background of this place in the game did indeed come from the Black Tower Wizards. The Black Tower Wizards are the most powerful mage organization in Erewhon, and like wizards in many other places, their curiosity for secrets and knowledge is unparalleled. Like the Buga Wizards, in order to explore those lost secrets, the Black Tower Wizards' footprints are also all over the ruins of this kingdom. This mysterious forest is no exception. "My lord, you're saying that the Black Tower Wizards once sent an investigation team into this forest, and here?" Lorena reacted. "Pretty much what you guessed, but slightly different." Brando recalled the records of this place in the strategy guide as he replied, "The Black Tower Wizards have entered this forest more than once in their hundreds of years of history, and except for the dangerous area in the center, they have long known this area." He looked at Lorena and added, "You don't think that guy Erek would rush into this forest rashly, do you? He must have someone around him who is familiar with this forest, just like me, and maybe that guy is also a Black Tower wizard." "But aren't the Black Tower wizards and the Highland Knight allies, Brando, you?" Freya asked with some confusion. "There are all kinds of birds in the forest, and not all Black Tower wizards abide by the Tower Agreement," the Shire immediately explained. "Exactly," Brando continued, "but this is not the topic we want to discuss. Back then, the Black Tower wizards probably came here to destroy a very powerful demonic item, and they hoped to use a magic circle here to completely destroy the demonic item from Jorgendy Ridge." He paused for a moment, "but there was a traitor in the team at that time, and a wizard was tempted by the demonic power, and in the end, the whole operation was in vain. It is said that the demonic item exploded violently on the magic circle, blowing nearly 100 Black Tower wizards and apprentices who accompanied it into ashes. The souls of these people were eroded in the dark magic, and gradually formed demonic spirits that wandered around here. Nearly 100 wizards." Lorena sucked in a breath of cold air in disbelief. She could totally imagine how tragic the scene was at that time. Everyone else's faces also showed some seriousness. But Brando just smiled. The whole incident was not as terrible as they had imagined. If the Black Tower wizards killed nearly 100 official wizards at once, the organization would not be far from falling apart. There were actually only 12 official wizards, including the traitor, and most of the others were apprentices. However, the demonic spirits left behind were true, and he continued, "Of course, the demonic item is said to have been destroyed in the explosion, but the Black Tower wizards still set up an observation post in this place for insurance. This post is said to have been in use for nearly 100 years, and was only abandoned in the last century." Observation post. Philas was stunned and couldn't help but look around. "How come I don't see it? Has it been torn down?" Of course not, the wizard's observation post naturally wouldn't be one of those fortresses you see on a daily basis. At this time, Maynard, who had been silent all this time, suddenly spoke. "Brando, you were looking for the location of that outpost before, weren't you?" Brando nodded. "That magic coordinate is a guiding point. The wizard's literature says that the outpost should be next to the cedar tree, in the direction pointed by the shadow of the wings behind Medisha. But I don't see anything." Philas looked over there. "Could that thing be in the sky?" Brando glared at the guy, speechless. Now he was beginning to believe in the guy's bullshit luck. He didn't expect the guy to hit the nail on the head. He raised his head and replied, "Yes, the real outpost is in the sky. We have to find a way to summon it down." "Summon it down?" Lorena frowned. "I see, it can help us deal with these demonic spirits, right? Since the wizards built such a tower, its original purpose was to guard against these demonic spirits." "Exactly," Brando said with slight approval. But he understood that in fact, the knight from Cruz was not entirely right. In the Amber Sword, there was often more than one way to pass through many plot areas. He also had a way to sneak through the valley without attracting the attention of the demonic spirits. But Brando wasn't going to give up such a large amount of EXP. Besides, if the records on the strategy guide weren't false, the outpost tower should be one of the treasure locations in this dungeon. This quest was originally an extra reward. But of course, he couldn't say these things out loud. He turned back and said, "The Shire, you should know the spells that the Black Tower wizards use to summon the Wizard Tower." The Shire immediately nodded and replied telepathically, "I've forgotten a lot after the change, but at least I remember one or two." After all, the Black Tower wizards were originally part of the Buga people. "That's good." Brando glanced at the demonic spirits in the distance and began to give orders. "It takes a certain amount of time to summon the tower, but once the spell starts, the demonic spirits over there will discover us. So when the Shire summons the tower, the task of the others is to protect him and complete the quest." As soon as Brando's voice fell, it was like a signal for battle. Maynard, Freya, Lorena and her husband, and the guards immediately drew their long swords, and Scarlet and Medisha also picked up their spears. Everyone subconsciously arranged themselves in a semicircle around the Silver Fairy Princess' current position. Brando showed a satisfied look and also pulled out the Halran Gaia. At the same time, he reminded them, the demonic spirit's attack method is very simple. They rarely fight hand-to-hand, but be careful that their attacks can penetrate physical armor. Also, be careful of their spells. Medisha, Scarlet, you stay to protect the spellcaster and Heroes. The others find a way to get close to them quickly. Understood. The Shire, you start. The young mage attendant nodded. He stood behind Medisha, felt the location of the magic mark, then raised his staff and began to chant the spell to summon the wizard tower. And this incantation, which was not loud, seemed to be an eye-catching signal in the darkness. Suddenly, everyone saw the dots of light in the forest stop slightly. Then they suddenly rose into the air, as if looking for the source of the spell. They circled over the forest and turned their heads to pounce on this side. The literature says that although most of the demonic spirits were outstanding wizards in their lifetime, they have long forgotten the profound knowledge. The spells they are good at are just the use of pure dark magic. These out-of-order magic won't last too long. They usually launch the first wave of spell attacks from 100 feet away. Medisha looked at the balls of light and was the first to remind them. The speed of the demonic spirits floating in the darkness was extremely fast. At this time, they had already come close. At this time, everyone could see their appearance clearly. These luminous balls of light in the darkness looked like the image of a human or elf with a naked upper body. They almost retained their appearance when they were alive, but their faces and chests were full of patterns eroded by dark magic. There were no eyeballs in their eye sockets, only a pitch black. This horrible appearance left a deep impression on everyone, and the little prince was so scared that he let out a low cry. To be exact, it's 141 feet. Brando stared in that direction and raised his sword. Measure the distance yourself. The demonic spirits had stopped at the edge of the forest. The distance was exactly the same as in Brando's memory, and it was also the farthest range of their spells. These distorted creatures raised their hands. Their hands had become ugly and sharp because of the distortion of magic. From these slender fingertips, suddenly, a black flame spurted out. These tentacle-like black flames intertwined. At that moment, it was like a big black net falling from the sky, enveloping everyone in it. P.S. I'm going to have New Year's dinner tomorrow. I'll come back at night to write. It depends on the situation. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Calm to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 726. The intertwining tentacles of flame spread in an instant, burning through the canopy and shrouding everyone's heads. But because of Brando's warning in advance, everyone was already prepared. The moment the black fire net was in the air, they all ran wildly to the left or right, out of the spell's range. The black flames formed by the dark magic covered down, burning through the branches and leaves, turning the cedar forest into pillars of fire, burning fiercely and spectacularly, but not a single person was hurt. Even the weakest of the guards, the knight, barely avoided the fire net. All of this happened in an instant. But the blink of an eye was a rather long period of time for warriors above the silver rank, long enough for them to instantly accelerate to a speed of more than 100 feet per second. Especially Scarlet, Maynard, and Lorena, the air was torn apart by their terrifying acceleration, forming conical waves of air. The whistling of the sharp arrows pierced the woodland, and the pale human figures opened their black mouths and let out silent screams, as if this was how they communicated with each other. The demonic spirits turned around, and their slender fingers turned to the three girls in the lead in unison. But as if their hearts were connected, the three figures turned and changed direction at the same time, drawing long tails in the forest. The trajectory changed so that each of the black flames only hit the trunk behind them. The three figures drew a long semicircle at the same time, at almost the same speed, but Lorena was the first to attack. When the young knight landed, the long sword in her hand, Avila's pride, was already in attack mode. She pursed her lips tightly, and her sky-blue eyes were as sharp as an eagle's. Her light body was already like a taut string in midair, and the moment she landed, the long semicircle in the forest seemed to be straightened at one point, like a bullet leaving the chamber. After a point, it drew a bright line and pierced straight into the demonic spirits. But this dazzling trajectory was destined to have no journey. Its beginning and end seemed to be folded into one point, and Lorena's figure was folded at these 2 points at the same time. Then the figure in front faded away, and the figure behind held a sharp sword, the blade as bright as silver, and stabbed it right in the middle of the demonic spirit's heart. The glowing pale human figure in the forest seemed to still maintain the expression of the wide-open, pitch-black mouth. A silver line streaked across its chest to its back. The attack was like a fleeting meteor, but the pitch-black mark on the pale human body proved that it had indeed existed. Half of the demonic spirit's body hung down in a weird manner, and dark magic gushed out of the wound. The center of the wound was like a small nebula. It constantly escaped in all directions, spewing out countless dark substances, and finally spread into a huge halo. As the halo swept past, it was as if an explosion had swept across the entire forest. Everyone felt their chests tighten. Dark Magic, the night girl who bore the brunt of the attack, groaned. "Be careful, they seem to release a large amount of dark magic after they die. These forces will weaken us." Maynard and Scarlet paused. "How big is the range? Can you think of a way to avoid it?" The black flames in the hands of the other demon spirits swept across, and the cedar trees in front of it were set ablaze. Maynard could only retreat and ask cautiously. "I don't know. The range is 1,000 feet. You can't avoid it. Try to extend the time interval between killing them. The magic erosion will last for 6 or 7 minutes. Brando's voice came from afar. "Extend the time interval between killing them. How do we do that?" After the 3 girls, Faraz was also close to the demon spirits. He looked up at the dense clusters of light rising from the canopy and couldn't help but gasp. "Scarlet, interrupt their spells first." Brando stared at the demon spirits in the sky like stars in a summer night and calmly commanded. He stood beside the Shire and the young prince, and didn't seem to intend to participate in the battle. Because he understood that he couldn't always fight on the front line. This was a dungeon, and he first needed a reliable team. And the first step to building a team was to understand the level that each member of the team could perform in battle. So he forced himself to calm down and observe the others' performance in battle. Lorena's attack was too fast, he didn't even have time to warn her. Fortunately, it was just a demon spirit, and the backlash of the dark magic only weakened her for a short period of time. If she had hit a self-destructing creature like the Bone Demon or the planetary body, this Miss Knight from Cruz would have been disfigured even if she didn't die. In the face of unknown monsters, one must be cautious. Some monsters' abilities could even leave one with no chance of regret. Flash Strike sword art was indeed a double-edged sword. It was so amazingly fast that it would play an unimaginable role in certain scenes. But once the user was too impulsive, it would be easy to get into danger. After receiving the order, Scarlet's agate eyes turned as she thought about how to do this. But she looked up at the demon spirits flying all over the sky. Fighting seemed to have become an instinct, and she came up with a solution in an instant. Countless black flames chased after her, cutting through the ground in midair. But the mountain girl's body had already paused, her fiery red ponytail swinging in a circular trajectory. She stopped with one foot on the ground, bringing a shockwave that pushed up a layer of snow with a pop sound. But at the same time, she put her right hand back, and the cloth wrapped around the azure lance was scattered layer by layer. With a soft hiss, the demon spirit's black flame tentacles all hit the flying snow, and the high temperatures suddenly turned the ice crystals into steam. White steam rose into the air, but behind the mist, the girl had already assumed an attacking stance. An arc of lightning ejected from the shaft of the lance in her hand. Flames swept across the canopy, and the branches suddenly burned as if a layer of fire cloud was formed above Scarlet's head. But Scarlet had already roared, and stabbed the lance into the sky above the forest. The blade of the lance vibrated violently, and the surrounding space seemed to be staggered, thousand army strike. This was Medish's unique skill, the specialty of the Silver Sky Knight. The blade of the lance pushed the air to compress it into a point, and then shot out like a cannonball. With a loud bang, the burning canopy seemed to have been blown into a huge hole by the blast, and the originally raging flames suddenly turned into countless sparks and scattered. The power of this move that Scarlet had just learned was far inferior to the focus lance that Medish had used before, but at the same time as her attack, there was also the special effect of the azure lance. Countless lightning bolts pierced into the night sky, like a blooming golden chrysanthemum, but each arc of lightning was its upward curved arc-shaped petals, densely packed and innumerable. Scarlet's gaze was changing rapidly, too fast for the eye to take in, and almost every arc of lightning accurately hit a demon spirit. Although the attack of a single arc of lightning was weak, it was enough to repel the almost incorporeal demons. The approaching demon spirits were swept away in an instant, and the sky was empty. The demon spirit's spell paused for a moment. Pahimra, rock shield, stick close to those demon spirits. Brando frowned slightly. Scarlet had been with him for the longest time, and had basically adapted to his fighting style, but it was still a little too wasteful. Although compared to others of her age, this kind of fighting style was already very high. But it was still far from the standard of a top player, and even worse than him. The priestess dressed in a white linen robe took 2 steps forward barefoot. She picked up the oak staff in her hand, and gently tapped the ground twice. A greenish-gray wall of light appeared between the demon spirits and everyone. Master Planeswalker, this wall can only be maintained for 5 seconds. Pahimra reminded him in his mind, it would be good if it could recover some more power, but now I can only maintain it at the level of a 3rd circle spell. It's enough, but it's still too far. Brando replied, and then immediately said to the others, the rock shield can block all attacks that are not physical attacks, but the creatures of order can freely pass through this wall. Everyone else, pass through this wall immediately and attack the outermost demon spirits, only injuring but not killing them. Pahimra, prepare the next wall, the casting position is still between the demon spirits in us. As soon as he finished speaking, as if to verify his words, the demon spirit's next round of spell attacks all hit the rock shield. Black flames exploded on the wall of light, turning into a dazzling ball of fire. Maynard, Lorena, and the others had already understood Brando's tactics, and as soon as the opponent's spell was over, they would immediately cross the greenish wall of light and cut into the demon spirit's formation. But this time, the night girl from Cruz had learned to be smart. She often cut off the demon spirit's arm with a sword, and then swept it out with a wind sword. The night guards followed closely behind and did the same. Originally, in terms of strength, the demon spirits were slightly stronger than these night guards, but Pahimra's rock shield was almost close to these demon spirits, and as soon as the knight rushed out of the wall of light, it was equivalent to entering the demon spirit's close range. After losing the ability to attack from a distance, the demon spirit's close combat ability was so weak that it made one's hair stand on end. They were no match for the professional silver-ranked warriors, and were often easily forced to retreat by the knight Brando had brought. But what made Brando a little annoyed was that the knight's attacks were often not as accurate as Lorena's and Maynard's. From time to time, a black halo would explode in the forest, and everyone's strength would drop again and again. It's a pity that there are too few geniuses like Lorena and Maynard. If I had known, I would have let Breton stay. Brando couldn't help but shake his head. He had one hand on the hilt of his sword, ready to join the battle at any time when the front line couldn't hold on. But miraculously, after the strength of the night guards was greatly reduced, the demon spirits also became less easy to kill, and the battle became easier for a while. He heaved a sigh of relief when he saw this. The pale human figures screamed silently in annoyance and began to retreat, but often when they retreated a certain distance and were ready for the next round of spells, another green wall of light descended in front of them. The knight couldn't help but cheer when he saw this. They couldn't imagine how the Lord came up with such an outrageous tactic in such a short time, but no one wouldn't welcome a one-sided battle. Of all the people, only Brando and Pahimera frowned. "How much magic did you use?" Brando asked in his heart. "I've already cast the rock shield 7 times, and used a total of 161 points of magic power," the priestess replied. Brando pursed his lips. This number was about the same as what he had calculated. In the Amber Sword, Level 1 spells cost 5 points of magic power, Level 2 spells cost 10 points of magic power, Level 3 spells cost 20 points of magic power, and so on. However, the actual cost of magic power had to be factored in with the spellcaster's own correction coefficient, so it wasn't possible for a player to roughly calculate the cost of a spell. In fact, when the Shire, Metasha, and Pahimera became planeswalker creatures, he could check the detailed creature data of their cards and see the same panel as the players. Among them, Pahimera's initial data was Strength 1. 5, Dexterity 2. 5, Constitution 1. 5, Intelligence 2. 1, Willpower 4. 2, Wisdom 2. 2, Bloodline 4. 0, and her initial magic power was 100 points. After leveling up to level 30, her willpower and bloodline rose to 47. 7 and 102. 4 respectively, and her magic power pool also expanded to 300 points. In other words, if nothing unexpected happened, she could cast about 6 more spells. Even if she completely calculated the interval between the demon spirit's attacks, she could at most drag it out for a minute. Moreover, in Brando's opinion, Pahimera was far from being able to estimate the time so accurately. This team was still far from what he wanted. In the game, this tactic was researched and developed by the Crystal Apple Guild, but it wasn't used like this in the real world. Instead, it required the team members to kill multiple demon spirits at the same time, and then the Majestic Mountain Priest or the Templar Priest would cast Steadfast Shield to block the backfire of the dark magic. But now, whether it was the knight or Pahimera, it was clear that they couldn't make such precise calculations, so he had to come up with a compromise. But 1 minute could be said to be enough. Brando took one last look at the fierce battle at the front line, then turned his head. Some scattered demon spirits in the forest had already bypassed the defensive line and came to their flank. But there were Freya and Metasha in that direction, so it wasn't a problem for the time being. But when he looked over there, he suddenly reached out his hand and instantly activated his space element. A demon spirit that was still wandering in the distance couldn't resist at all, and was instantly swallowed by the power of space, and in the blink of an eye, it appeared not far away from him. It was the soul of a female elven mage, who seemed to have been a beautiful lady when she was alive, but now she had become a thoughtless shell. This demon spirit was seized by Brando's elemental power and was forcibly stripped to this place. For a moment, it seemed to be confused, but Brando had already taken out a magic crystal from his pocket. The strong magic aura emitted by the crystal instantly attracted the demon spirit, and she immediately turned around. At that moment, the hunter girl Peya and the little prince on the wolf's back screamed in fright. The elven mage's wide-open eyes couldn't see the whites at all, but were pitch black, like a ghost. Her mouth was also full of black smoke, and her whole body was like a puppet overflowing with dark magic. This terrifying appearance, coupled with the near-perfect curves of her naked upper body, was filled with a strange sense of beauty. Heroes. T. Teacher. Here's a gift for you. Brando suddenly pulled open the back collar of the little Prince Herose and threw the magic crystal inside. The cold crystal immediately made the beautiful boy shiver, and his face seemed to be even paler. Dash. But before this short cry could finish, it came to an abrupt stop. Because he had already seen that pair of pitch-black eyes staring at him. Erwin, the future king, was stunned. Brando, what are you doing? Freya just happened to see this scene when she turned her head. Teacher? Herose asked in trepidation. Brando didn't answer them. He smiled slightly and picked out a glimmering magic sword that he had prepared long ago from the dimensional space. Then he threw it to the prince's side. This sword is called Hillcrest's Loyalty Eye. Take it now and kill that demon spirit. The little prince was completely dumbfounded and looked at him pitifully. Go. Brando said sternly, if you don't kill her, she will kill you. The little prince was frightened by Brando's reprimand, and then he picked up the sword on the ground tremblingly, but the sword was obviously too heavy for him, and he had to use both hands to barely hold the hilt. The blade dragged on the ground in a very undignified manner, and his face was red, and he was about to cry. But he sniffed hard and still turned to the demon spirit, trembling. Brando looked at the little prince's weak appearance, just like a pitiful little girl. He raised his head and saw that the devil spirit was almost 140 feet away from him. In fact, he had already seen it raise its thin and long arms. He shook his head and decided to help Herose again. The next moment, the little prince disappeared in an instant, and when he reappeared, he was already in front of the demon spirit. At that moment, both Herose and the demon spirit opposite him seemed to be startled. The little prince was shocked by the sudden appearance of the monster in front of him, and the demon spirit was shocked by the unexpected appearance of its prey in close combat range. Both of them opened their mouths at the same time and stared at each other. Student Herose, Brando reminded, if you don't take care of him in 5 minutes, the next time I see Micaiah, I will make you change into women's clothing. At this time, Peya, who was dumbfounded, seemed to react. Wait, who is Hillcrest? She seemed to be very concerned about the magic sword. He is a knight. It is said that a wizard riding a dragon killed his fiancée and his whole family. Later, in order to get revenge, he specially developed a set of tactics to deal with wizards. Although this set of legacies has been lost, his sword was left behind, which is the famous wizard's nemesis. Brando replied. I seem to have heard my father tell this story. Peya blinked her dark eyes, but why is that sword called Hillcrest's Loyalty Eye? Because I made 10 of this sword. Brando answered simply. P.S. Well, I snuck back to write it after New Year's dinner. I don't want to live anymore, do I? Please support me, my lords, and it is said that there is no double, so don't keep the monthly votes or anything, just smash me to death. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 727. Today is the Spring Festival. First of all, I wish everyone a happy new year, and hope that everything goes well in the new year. For those who are still in school, your studies will be successful, and for those who are already working, you will be promoted and get a raise. Same goes for me. I'm sure everyone knows that I plan to finish Amber's Sword by this year, but of course, it won't be a bad ending, so I will definitely have to ensure that I write at least 300,000 words every month, or even more. But the days when you can fight are more exciting, so I'm here to encourage you. Some of the words in Amber's Sword are actually what I want to say to everyone. No matter how the world changes, people with faith and ideals will never fall behind. The struggle of a person's life is originally only for the realization of one's self-worth. To realize this value, we need to cherish those initial feelings. Ideals may sometimes be stained with dust, but a dusty diamond will eventually be washed clean and shine brightly. As long as you don't forget your goal, you will definitely succeed. Finally, let's talk about this month's update. Everyone has seen the previous month's update, but because of the Spring Festival, I can only guarantee a daily average of 6K updates this month. Of course, to be honest, it's also for the sake of full attendance. I also insisted on coming back for New Year's dinner yesterday and wrote 5,000 words. But I can't do it today. It's the last day of the year, and everything is getting rid of the old and ushering in the new. I also have to spend time with my family, so I have to take a leave here. I won't ask for monthly votes here. Tomorrow, on the first day of the new year, I'll give everyone a big burst of good luck, and then open a chapter to ask for monthly votes. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 728. Heroes, hold on to your sword. Think of your sister, you should be fighting not just as a warrior, but as a man. The little prince stood there in a daze. The elven sorceress finally reacted. She lowered her head and looked down at this little prey. Her beast-like instincts and intuition made the corners of her mouth curl up into a sneer. Like a cat teasing a mouse, she slowly approached him, lowered her body, and wrapped her slender arms around the little prince's neck. She reached into his clothes to search for the magic crystal. Heroes was petrified. His beautiful eyes were wide open, and there was a silver mist in them. The elf's delicate nose took short breaths. Reason told him that he should aim for the soft belly of the other party and stab it hard, but the long sword in his hand seemed to weigh more than 1,000 pounds, his arms seemed to be stiff, and the swordsmanship he had learned seemed to slip away from his mind, leaving a blank, and his palms seemed to be sweating. What's more, the sorceress was still looking into his eyes with her dark eye sockets. The dark magic was best at eroding people's hearts, and the sorceress could easily detect the little prince's fear. Her beautiful snow-white face cracked into a dark crescent moon as she looked at him with a contemptuous sneer. Half of the sorceress' body was already close to Prince Heroes, deliberately pressing her soft hemisphere against his cheek, her slender arm hanging behind Heroes' neck like a spider, and her pointed fingers almost groping for the magic crystal. But her thirst for magic was of course far more than that little magic crystal, and the little prince with the talent of a wizard was the most delicious meal in her eyes. Heroes trembled violently, he turned his head stiffly and looked at Brando pleadingly. Sir Knight, he is really not fit to fight. The huntress page could not stand it anymore. He must fight, he has chosen this path, and he must face it with courage. Brando replied seriously, turning a blind eye to Heroes' pleading eyes. Paige stammered for a while, wanting to say something, but in the end she stopped. People must fight for their own reasons, Miss Hunter. But Heroes' reason is particularly different. It's not because of glory, beliefs, or ideals, but because he must become strong in order to respond to the expectations of many. But a person can't always live in the expectation of others. Even though she knew that her status was low, the hunter girl couldn't help but retort. She thought she would be severely reprimanded by the knight, but Brando just asked in a gentle tone, "Will you live for your brother's expectations, Miss Peya?" "Aye. The people who truly have expectations for you are the people closest to you. It's not good to believe them, because there's nothing perfect in this world. I'm sorry, you don't have to apologize for my identity as a noble. Even if your words are as sharp as a sword, they will only correct my mistakes. Besides, as she wasn't. And as I said, everyone has their own path." Paige looked at the count suspiciously. There were some things that she couldn't quite understand. But she vaguely felt that Brando was very different from the noble she had seen in Shallow Water Town, and even from the polite knight Manuel. Brando raised his voice, "Heroes, everyone has their first lesson in life. Your sister must have told you what the basic qualities of a warrior are." The little prince's heart was in a mess, and he had no time to listen to this sentence clearly, but the last few words penetrated his chaotic thoughts, as if knocking on his heart, the basic qualities of a warrior. The snow in Winterclaw Castle was always thin, but when it fell, it accumulated thick. Behind the snowflake stood his sister, piercing the curtain of snow with a voice so stern that it scared him. In the face of battle, the first thing a swordsman needs to do is to be calm, analyze his situation, and understand what he should do, but his heart was pounding, and he couldn't calm down at all. Use your will to fight, not your sword. There is no one in this world who doesn't make mistakes, but only cowards are afraid of making mistakes and don't dare to draw their swords. Answer in your heart to all those who rely on you. Are you going to be a coward, or fight to the last moment like a real man? I don't know. The little prince felt the cold breath of the demon spirit lingering around him, and the other's cold fingertips brushed across his back, as if the next moment, he would be dragged into the endless dark abyss. He couldn't help but close his eyes tightly, tears flowing down uncontrollably, but his pale little face was flushed with a strange shade of blood. He gasped sharply. Have you seen the Royal Academy's trainee exam? If you don't hand in the answer sheet, you'll never get a score. Even if I hand in the answer sheet, I may get a 0. I can't do it. I can't learn any swordsmanship. I just want to be with my sister. I can't fight. I don't want to die. There was a soft click, the sound of the tip of the sword bouncing as it was unsheathed. The little prince was almost crying as he shouted. But there was a sharp metallic sound mixed in with the cry, and the dark eyes of the demon spirit holding Hera's suddenly widened, and she suddenly stepped back, the cold blade of the sword almost brushing past her lower abdomen. Hera's was like a windmill spinning the sword, and because he used too much force, he himself was carried around in a circle by the force of the sword. This scene was too horrible to look at. It was as if a person who had never used a sword before had no idea how to use a sword. Or, it was as if a student of the Royal Academy had picked up a quill and a drop of ink had dripped from the tip of the quill, staining the snow-white paper. But at least he picked up the pen. Hera's dragged the sword and gasped for breath, his eyes wide open, as if he couldn't believe that he had actually drawn the sword. For a moment, it seemed like a dream. He looked up and saw the retreating demon spirit with a puzzled look on her face. She probably didn't understand how this little prey suddenly grew fangs. But her reaction was simple, that is, she raised her slender long hand and pointed her 5 fingers at Hera's. Be careful. Peya saw this scene and couldn't help but remind him. Sister. The little prince felt his mind go blank and immediately raised the long sword in front of him, then turned his head away and closed his eyes tightly. Such a battle was simply too horrible to watch, and Brando didn't know how he could bear to watch. When he first fought, it was 100 times better than this, but this was probably the so-called natural advantage of players. 5 black flames spewed out from the demon spirit's fingertips and instantly reached Hera's, but it was at this moment that a light green light flashed on Hillcrest's loyalty in his hand, and a light green shield emerged to block, and the black flames were instantly shattered. Ah! The hunter maiden was stunned. The little prince also reacted and stared at the sword in his hand in a daze. He seemed to want to turn back and ask Brando, but he was beaten back by Brando's cold words. What are you waiting for? Fight back. Hera seemed to wake up from a dream, and as if he had regained some of his training instincts, he immediately turned around and slashed at the demon spirit. But his movements were only slightly better than a clumsy beginner's, and the demon spirit didn't even dodge, and he slashed at the air with his own sword. Don't be so stiff, save some strength. I know. Hera's finally regained his balance, and he straightened up to find the demon spirit again, but the astonishment on the elven wizard's face had turned into contempt again. She grinned in silent mockery and gently circled behind the little prince. Watch your back. It was Peya's voice, and she looked at Hera's as if she had replaced her younger brother. The demon spirit raised her thin claws and slapped down on Hera's head. But it was at that moment that Hera shifted his right foot and lowered his body, and his body had entered the widely spread defensive posture of Cruz's aristocratic swordsmanship. The knight's defensive swordsmanship. Brando's eyes lit up. The little boy's eyes were clear, and his heart seemed to calm down. The wolf of the kingdom, his sister, and Maynard taught him countless classic examples of attacking from behind came to his mind one by one. He lowered his head and at the same time, slashed back with the long sword in his hand. The demon spirit's slender, almost disproportionate claws swept over him, and apparently did not expect the former's sword from below to above. It was only when the gleaming tip of the sword appeared in its range of perception that it suddenly realized. The demon spirit leaned back, but the sword still slashed across its chest, leaving a thin black line there. Compared with the demon spirit's defense, Haru's attack was pitifully weak. But the counterattack still made it immediately alert, and it floated back to open up the distance, and 5 more demon flames shot at the little prince. But Erwin, the future little king, was completely in the zone. He closed his eyes and felt as if he was back in the snowy arena of the Winter Claw Fort, and even better than that time. He raised Hilka's loyalty with both of his hands, and the black flames hit the shield that suddenly appeared and exploded again. The falling flames scattered on the snowy ground, burning a patch of potholes. Haruz took a breath. Erwin's military swordsmanship. Inherited from the Wind Elves, it was known as the most orthodox light combat swordsmanship suitable for humans to practice. After Darius's improvement, this swordsmanship had shown a strong offensive aura. With a single stride, he arrived in front of the Devil Spectre. This clumsy dash was naturally useless in Brando's eyes, but Haruz's ability to switch from defense to offense so quickly was beyond his expectations. He pursed his lips slightly. Haruz's frontal attack was a little clumsy even in the eyes of the demon spirit. Before he could stand firm, the demon spirit swept him with its claws and tripped him, and he fell into the snow. But he immediately stumbled up and raised his sword to block the demon spirit's dark flames. But this time, Hilka's loyalty did not completely block the spell for him as he expected. The moment the dark magic hit the shield, the long sword broke in the middle with a crack, and the broken part turned into silver powder and scattered. He was also bounced back by the huge force and fell into a pile of thick snow. Brando smacked his lips when he saw this. After blocking 3 level 3 spells, Hillman's loyalty was even better than he had expected. He stretched out his hand, and with a flash of white light, an identical longsword appeared in his hand. Hilka's loyalty too. Continue. He deliberately threw the second sword far away, and the little prince jumped and rolled in the snow before he grabbed the sword. He looked like a little snowman at the moment, but at least his posture of drawing the sword was decent. With a sharp clang, the sharp blade left the sheath and drew a perfect curve with the flying snowflakes. As soon as the sword was out of the sheath, it immediately met the 5 black flames coming from the front. With a loud bang, the flames made of dark magic exploded like fireworks. And in the midst of the scattered sparks, a figure shot out. Haruz seemed to have finally noticed the demon spirit's weakness and rushed forward, holding the long sword in his hand and slashing at the elven wizard's slender claws. The demon spirit's dark eyes widened, and she tried to avoid the suddenly rebellious little beast with a backhand claw. But to Peya's and even the demon spirit's own surprise, the previously weak little boy seemed to have a wolfish nature in him at this moment. He gritted his teeth like a little wolf cub and went up hard. The demon spirit's claws pierced his shoulder, and flesh and blood flew. Erwin's little prince screamed, but he swung his right hand in pain and cut the demon spirit's left claw with his sword. Unfortunately, he didn't use enough strength and only left a deep gash there. The demon spirit screamed in pain, but she couldn't make a sound. She opened her big black mouth and slapped the little prince away again. Haruz's body rolled in the snow before he landed, and the black flames swept towards him again. This scene was reflected in his eyes, which was completely beyond what he had learned in the arena. But at that moment, as if it was an instinct to survive, he thrust his sword down in midair, and the black flames once again hit the shield that flashed around him. The flames suddenly exploded, and the huge impact made him unable to hold the sword any longer, and he flew out until he hit a cedar tree far away. Brando looked at the demon spirit. He knew that the other party should have no magic power left. Magic power was life for demon spirits, and they couldn't risk their lives to cast spells again. He took out the third sword and threw it far away again. Hildebrand's loyalty 3. Heraeus, who was covered in cuts and bruises, caught the sword this time. His whole body was trembling slightly, but his action of drawing the sword was still meticulous. He looked up, and the demon spirit didn't launch another long-range attack, but hesitated from a distance whether to retreat or not. But apparently, the fragrance of Heraeus' magic made her hesitate. The little prince couldn't care so much. His mind was in chaos now, but his spirit was in a state of high excitement. He never thought that he could fight such a monster. Although he didn't know how powerful the demon spirit was, he knew how good the knights selected from his sister's guards were. He took a deep breath and held the hilt of the long sword in his left and right hands at the same time. This action, Brando was slightly startled. Ha! Peya on the side also made a soft sound of surprise. In the snow, a white light rose into the sky, like a crescent moon, and instantly crossed half of the woodland and went straight to the demon spirit. It was accompanied by Heraeus' childish roar, "Ah dash!" To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 729. When Brando saw the white raven swordsmanship of the Erewhon royal family, he knew that there was no need to continue watching. He was sure that at this age, there was no one in the palace who could teach the little prince this swordsmanship. Heraeus must have secretly watched this swordsmanship from somewhere, and from his awkward posture, Brando could tell that this was the first time he tried to use this swordsmanship. The pure silver moonlight had already explained everything. Other than the chosen one, Brando could not think of a second possibility to explain this scene. The article on the forum was actually true, and not only was he a revelation, but he could also be a revelation with both magic and swordsmanship. He closed his mouth and let out a long sigh in his heart. Until now, he finally understood that the little prince's only enemy in the future was probably himself. If one day he could overcome his fear of himself and walk out of the shadow of Princess Griffin, then he would probably become a hero more outstanding than the late King Eric. But now, he was also his student. No teacher would be dissatisfied with their student's excellence. Brando could not help but smile. "Mr. Brando, I don't have much mana left." At this time, Hippamra's voice sounded. Brando turned his head, and the priestess was already sweating profusely. He immediately asked the Shire, "How much longer do you have?" The Shire looked at him with a serious face, as if he wanted to say something. "Is there not enough time?" Brando frowned. No, it has been prepared for a long time." The young wizard had a strange expression. "It's just that I saw that my lord was very interested in teaching that little guy, so I didn't want to disturb your mood." Brando immediately looked at this guy with a bit of annoyance. Although each of the creatures he summoned had their own personality, the Shire was probably the only one who dared to make fun of him. Even if it was Falerne, she would at most give him the cold shoulder. The Shire seemed to have expected that he would be unlucky if he did this. He quickly diverted his attention and clapped his hands, shouting, "Come out, the tower in the fog." This move was indeed effective. 6 silver lines descended from the sky and pierced into the ground. Then, more silver lines extended horizontally from above. Countless lines connected with each other, forming a hexagonal pillar in the blink of an eye. This scene immediately attracted everyone's attention. As soon as the pillar was formed, it was more than 30 meters high and 10 meters wide. It already had the embryonic form of a mage tower. However, the Shire's summoning spell was far from over. The thicker lines were still subdivided into countless thinner lines. The silver lines began to expand on the 6 sides of the tower, gradually outlining the windows, bricks, beams, doors, and stairs. The bright silver on the earlier lines gradually dimmed as it was subdivided step by step, and finally settled back to its original color. Like red-hot molten steel fading little by little with the dissipation of heat, a pitch-black tall tower made of granite appeared in everyone's sight. Apart from Brando, even Lorena, her husband, and Maynard couldn't help but be a little surprised when they saw this scene. This was a miracle of magic to begin with. Everyone, Brando's voice rang out in the forest, retreat in an orderly manner immediately and enter the tower. Because they had lost Bahimra's spell support, the night guards were already exhausted from dealing with it. At this moment, after receiving Brando's order, they were the first to retreat. They retreated into the tower first and found that the inside of the tower was far bigger than what it looked like from the outside. It was a vast space, like a square, that could accommodate at least hundreds of people. Then Freya, Metisha, the Shire, and Peya also retreated into the tower. Meanwhile, the young prince was still entangled with the half-crippled demon spirit. Both of them were scarred, but neither could do anything to the other. After the demon spirit lost its magic power, it was a high-level infantryman, and the young prince's attack was not enough to kill it. Brando glanced at the battle over there and grabbed Haruz back with his hand. Haruz seemed to be a little hot-headed and struggled in his hand, but he calmed down after Brando said, "A swordsman must know when to back down. A good swordsman must first have a calm heart." The young prince quieted down at once, but he was still gasping for air. Brando nodded encouragingly to him, "You did well. If your sister had seen your previous battle, I'm sure she wouldn't be worried about you in the future." Haruz was slightly stunned and looked at him somewhat blankly. There was some confusion in his silver eyes, like an immature child. Brando reached out and tapped his chest. "You have to fight with your heart, not with your hot-bloodedness. You have to understand why you are fighting. Fighting is not just to overcome fear, but to dominate yourself." Haruz held his sword and nodded as if he understood. After Brando dragged the young prince back into the mage tower, Bahimra, Maynard, Lorena and her husband, and Scarlet, who were responsible for covering the rear, also retreated. As soon as they entered the tower, the demon spirits outside naturally followed. Maynard and Scarlet stood guard at the entrance of the mage tower, ready to rely on the terrain to resist the enemy, but it was at this time that something happened that surprised everyone. The demon spirit rushed to the entrance of the mage tower and was blocked on the outside as if it had hit an invisible wall. Those terrible monsters were baring their fangs and claws outside the invisible wall, but they could not move an inch. The Shire also recognized what it was at this time, a high-level exorcism array. "There's actually such a thing here." "My lord, did you already know?" Brando glanced at him and did not comment. However, the young wizard attendant had already trained his skin to be as thick as a city wall. Seeing that his lord ignored him, he did not care and just praised, "If we can move this tower away, we can do whatever we want in this forest." "But you can't." Lorena interrupted him, "If those demon spirits don't retreat for a while, we will be trapped here and can't move an inch." She looked back at Brando and asked, "Mr. Brando, do you have any ideas? Isn't the solution already in front of us?" Brando replied, "If those demon spirits don't retreat for a while, we can just wipe them all out." Wipe them out? The female knight was a little puzzled. If they could wipe out those demon spirits, would they still need to hide in this place? Of course, Brando nodded. "It didn't work before, but can it work now?" Now. Lorena was a little confused at first, but suddenly her eyes lit up. In terms of IQ, she was actually much higher than Brando, but as a native, she was often affected by the stereotype of thinking, unlike players who could think beyond the game itself. When natives consider problems, they often include the premise of whether it's reasonable, while when players consider problems, the first thing they consider is whether they can kill the enemy. As for rationality, that was a question that only game designers needed to consider. And now, there was a very illogical way to fight. Brando knew from her expression that she had understood, but the so-called terrain blocking combat method was actually commonplace in the eyes of players. It was just more difficult in the Amber Sword. And some of the so-called terrain was actually a trick set up by the game itself for players. This was the case at hand. He ordered, "Everyone else rest and prepare, the Shire, Medisha. You go attack those demon spirits, chase them out when they retreat when they catch up, and when the weakness stacks more than 20 times, go back to the tower and replace Hippamra and Freya. The third group is Maynard and Miss Lorena, you 3 groups rotate, understand?" He looked at the densely packed demon spirits outside the mage tower as if he was looking at a lot of floating experience. If it weren't for the fact that the 2 groups were really not enough to rotate, he wouldn't have let Maynard and Lorena go. After all, these experience points were only effective on the Shire, Medisha, and Hippamra, and it would be a waste to give them to others. Understood, watch me, my lord. The Shire seemed to understand this as well, and he immediately walked to the door a little eagerly. Medisha, who had always been much quieter, just saluted Brando respectfully, and then turned to follow. But she was a little curious, as the Silver Fairy Princess, although she had also heard of the Exorcism Circle, she didn't know as much as the Shire, who was born as a wizard. She couldn't help but look at the demon spirits outside in disbelief, and asked softly, "Can we attack them from inside the mage tower?" "Of course," the Shire replied. "The Advanced Exorcism Circle is a 2-way circle, both preventing the enemies outside from entering and the enemies inside from leaving. But its effect is only against demons, or humans with a pure dark magic aura. Astrologers and witches who use dark magic with the help of the laws don't count, but it can deal with some cultists." So powerful. But I seem to have only heard of the Exorcism Circle from my father before, and it was far from this powerful. That's because this spell was only unearthed from the ruins almost 1,000 years ago. The Bugas liked to dig holes everywhere, and we Black Tower wizards also benefited from it. The Shire shrugged, but this spell is indeed so powerful. Legend has it that it came from the technology of the Babel Tower, and the Exorcism Circle is just a simplified version of it. As long as it is not a superior demon, it can keep them out. This is an absolute effect, without any discount, and will not be weakened by the number of demons. However, an advanced exorcism circle requires a large amount of mana to maintain. The Black Tower sorcerer must have let this sorcerer tower absorb the surrounding mana. This mana is also the reason why so many demonic spirits are gathered here. I see. Medisha nodded gently, and she turned back. "You first, or I first?" The Shire smiled, rolled up his sleeves and said, "Doing the work for a noble lady is not the etiquette of the Silver Elf Society. Let me go first." He raised his hand, and the white light had gathered in his palm, forming a huge circle. Then a white beam of light shot out, like a blade sweeping into the dense demon spirits outside the wizard tower. In an instant, more than a dozen demon spirits in the front were turned into ashes. Then there were more than a dozen consecutive explosions of dark magic, but the shock wave was blocked by the advanced exorcism circle, and it did not affect the people inside. After being attacked, the demon spirits, who lacked intelligence, seemed to be subconsciously furious, and instead of escaping, they surged forward. But their actions were doomed to be futile, and the advanced exorcism circle was always like an invisible wall blocking them outside. The Shire was relieved to see this scene. After all, the advanced exorcism circle was just a term in a book for him. Who knew if the things in the book would lie? As a wizard and a scholar, the first thing they learned while learning was to question dogma and authority, and in their view, this was the difference between them and the believers. However, the power of the advanced exorcism circle was reassuring, and he did not think about it and released 2 or 3 more dragon strikes. After 4 spells, the Shire found that his experience had directly increased by 1 level. He could not help but be surprised and a little embarrassed. He was surprised that this way of killing the enemy was too easy, and the experience that he had accumulated with great difficulty was like picking it up from the ground. But the embarrassing thing was that the experience came too quickly, and he did not stop in time and actually repelled the demon spirits. Now, if he and Metasha wanted to continue to chase after those demon spirits, they would have to chase after them. He was fine with it, but he felt a little sorry for the little silver elf princess. He could not help but look at Metasha a little awkwardly. "It's okay." But the little silver elf princess smiled reasonably, and she raised her spear and said, "The Shire, cover me, I'll go close to them." Charles heaved a sigh of relief and nodded. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Calm to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 730. After the demonic spirits retreated from the outskirts of the Mage Tower, the battle outside slowed down. The battle soon switched to Maynard and Lorena's group, but Brando estimated that it would take at least 3 or 4 more rounds to completely wipe out these demonic spirits. It was a long time, but fortunately, he had something to do. The first floor of the Mage Tower was as large as a small square. Against the outer wall of the square, there was a spiral staircase leading up to the platform on the second floor. This platform was actually suspended between the square and the third floor above. The platform was a circular structure, surrounded by parapets and battlements. Brando looked like a defensive fortification no matter how he looked at it. Its purpose was self-evident. Naturally, it was used to attack the enemies on the first floor square after someone broke through the entrance of the Mage Tower. Presumably, when the Mage Tower was still in operation, it should have been full of mage guards and young apprentices, but now it was empty, leaving only the lifeless fortification itself. Even so, the Mage Tower was still full of danger. "Don't touch the mage's things," was a saying of the Karsuk people, and the Mage Tower, as the mage's most precious property, was a forbidden zone for ordinary people. This was especially true in an abandoned adept tower like this. The scattered magic energy, the magic traps that were still operating, the magic golems that had lost their masters, the dangerous creatures, the plants, and even the books on the shelves were full of mysteries and unknown. For an ordinary person, the best way to ensure their safety after entering this adept tower was to stay down there and not move at all. But this restriction was only for ordinary people. Brando knew another secret in the tower. He ordered everyone to rest where they were, and then he alone took Scarlet, the young prince, and Faraz up to the third floor of the Mage Tower. There was no physical connection between the third and second floors of the Mage Tower, but 12 teleportation portals transported manpower and supplies. These 12 portals were labeled with different colors, and Brando chose the red portal without thinking. Setting traps on the portals was the most vicious and the most common way for mages to guard against enemies. Red was a warning color to most people, but Brando knew that the colors of the 12 teleportation portals were not as simple as a warning. The Black Tower wizards linked them to Erwin's 12 months and the 12 magic moons. In different months, under different moon conditions, there would only be one teleportation circle that was the real one. Most of the other portals would send you to the Mountain of Ceasing Storms in a world of ice and snow, or the Lava Lands, or Malurcha's homeland, the Shallow Seas, or some corner of the world you couldn't even name. Although most teleportation arrays weren't fatal, their effects were far more dangerous than that. This was especially true for players. It was said that in the Amber Sword, there was an unlucky guy who barged into the teleportation circle and was sent to a kingdom called Hilma. He spent an entire year in real life, and after countless posts asking for help on the forums, he finally found a way to return to Wound. It was said that the rescue of this player could even be written into an epic. The players had come up with all sorts of strange ideas. For a long time after that, the players even set off a craze for going to other worlds. Because of Erwin's war, Brando didn't personally participate in the grand occasion of that event, but he knew that in the end, the players didn't really find out how many other worlds there were outside of Wound. It was just that these other worlds obviously existed a long time ago, and Kelsey came from one of them. Regarding these worlds, the players were more inclined to believe that they were the fragments of Martha's order that were scattered in the vast world of darkness. Wound was just one of the larger pieces. It took Brando a lot of effort to activate the portal, because he found that the mana pool of the facility inside the Wizard Tower was not the same as the mana pool of the Advanced Exorcism portal outside. The mana pool inside had obviously dried up long ago, and he had to use the magic crystals he carried with him to finally activate the portal. There was a flash of light in front of the four of them, and the next moment, they found that the scenery in front of them had changed. It was originally a rather spectacular defensive fortification. But now it had become a long, narrow, dark corridor. The mana pool in the Wizard Tower had long since dried up, and the magic illumination that was originally used was naturally no longer there. If it weren't for some strange luminous plants in the corridor, it was estimated that they would have seen darkness at this moment. But Brando was prepared. He took out the magic crystal, and the bright light immediately illuminated the corridor in front of them. It was as if this was the first time in a century that light had returned to this place. Brando heard a rustling sound, and then they all saw a large swath of vines retreat from the corridor as if shy, disappearing in the blink of an eye. Scarlet was still able to keep calm, but Faraz and the young prince couldn't help but feel a little creeped out when they saw this scene. They had seen a lot of things, but they had never seen a plant that could grow legs and run around on its own. What's more, the shape of the corridor was a bit of an eyesore. It was supposed to be a corridor paved with marble or obsidian. The walls on both sides were covered with bricks, and there were torches placed at intervals. Similar corridors could be seen in many castles or temples. But the one in front of them was like this, with many thick vines growing out of the broken bricks. The stone slabs on the ground had long been lifted up in pieces, and the corners were full of all kinds of plants as if they were tropical jungles. Most of them were ferns or some luminous fungi. If they hadn't seen it with their own eyes, it would have been hard to imagine that such a place would be a paradise for plants. But that was the way it was in the territory of wizards, and the average person called it a miracle of magic. It was just that this miracle was not necessarily friendly, and there was no shortage of folklore examples of touching things and being permanently turned into frogs. What is this place? Faraz opened his mouth in surprise and couldn't help but ask. This should be the uppermost level of the Wizard Tower, where the wizards live, Brando replied. The red teleportation circle, on the day the harp's magic overflowed in the month of flowing fire, was the only way to the upper levels of the Wizard Tower. Ah! Peruz suddenly cried out in a low voice. Although the wound on his shoulder had been bandaged, he could not help but frown at the movement of the wound. Then the little prince said a little curiously, "So those below are the 12 moon teleportation circles." 12 moons. Peruz seemed to have just realized that he was being a little rude for making a fuss over nothing. He blushed and explained in a low voice. "My sister and I have heard some rumors about the wizards from our father. The Black Tower wizards have some unique means of defense, and the 12 moon teleportation circle is one of the most famous. The wizards designed this complex array system according to the seasons and changes in the moon's waxing and waning on the continent of Wound. Legend has it that after the blueprint of this array was destroyed in an accident, no one has been able to solve it. Even the wizards of Buga once felt that it was a pity. It is said that although the proud silver folk despise this crude array technology, they admit that it contains the most exquisite astronomical and calendar calculations." Peruz's tone was a little excited. To even be praised by the silver folk, it is undoubtedly the pride of Erewhon. Philas pursed his lips. Didn't Mr. Brando solve it? The little prince thought of this question for a while, and he couldn't help but look at Brando with some admiration. "That's because the teacher is so knowledgeable, and even my sister admires the count. My sister has always been a proud person, and Master Fleetwood himself said that her knowledge was no less than his." As he said this, he couldn't help but look at Brando a little cautiously. This made Brando a little awkward, and he clearly heard the little prince's flattering tone. Besides, the complicated calculation of these teleportation circle passwords was certainly not something he had tinkered with, and it wasn't that the players were so wise. In fact, the way the players deciphered this set of passwords could be regarded as a model of brute force cracking. He remembered that a large guild had filled it in with human lives. He didn't remember the name of the guild, but the other party later received a handsome return. They sold the riddle and the magic circle itself to the Black Tower wizards, and it was said that they bought it for the price of a city. Wizards had always been the kind of people in Woned who didn't lack money, although it was rare to see them spend money extravagantly. But then again, this is where the wizards lived, there must be something valuable left in here, right? Philas seemed to have suddenly remembered this legend as well. I heard that everything the wizards own is a rare treasure. He was about to rush inside, but Brando hurriedly grabbed him and reminded him in a huff, "That's not true, the wizards just have more magic items in their hands. Believe me, you have a lot of them too, Mr. Philas. Not every magic item is valuable, and even if there is, it's for ordinary people, not for you." Philas was stunned for a moment before he reacted. "That's true. Then what are we doing here?" "You'll know in a moment." Brando breathed a sigh of relief, but still warned, "Be careful, it's a big maze inside. It's not like the ones in your garden, a wizard's maze, some people walk in and never come out, not to mention there are minotaurs inside. You must have never seen the monsters the wizards raised, they can eat you until there's not even bones left." Philas, who was about to move forward, was startled when he heard this and hurried back. "This tower has been here for at least a few centuries. Won't they starve to death? Have you ever seen a magic creature starve to death?" Philas blinked, as if he hadn't. Brando then lifted the illuminating crystal and walked forward. Although the plants around him were grotesquely shaped, he looked at them and found that they were basically harmless plants. The aggressive demon-devouring nepenthes and serpentine vines that adepts love to plant were nowhere to be seen here. However, this was probably because these two plants were carnivorous. Without food, they probably wouldn't survive for long. He followed the guide in his memory, turned left after passing 5 closed doors, and then walked about 100 steps forward. At his reminder, Philas, Scarlet, and the young prince tried not to look at the doors. In fact, even if Brando didn't say it, they had heard similar stories. Doors were a mysterious word for wizards, most of their doors led to mysterious other dimensions, and once mortals entered, they could forget about coming back. It was hard to tell the truth from the lies, but it was best not to treat them as jokes. After walking about 100 steps, Brando stopped. Sure enough, he saw a skeleton in the grass in front of him. It wasn't the skeleton of a wizard, because the skeleton was still wearing conspicuous armor. In the game, when the first player found it, it was in this position. That player thought that the skeleton should be an adventurer who came here later. As for how they found the wizard tower, he didn't know. But according to his analysis, the owner of the skeleton should be a warrior-type character in the team of adventurers. As for the cause of his death, Brando turned back and looked carefully at the grass. At this time, he noticed that Haruz beside him had a strange expression, so he stopped and asked, "Did you find something?" "Who is he?" the young prince asked curiously. "A warrior, or a knight, in short, definitely not a wizard. He's one of the wizard's guards. How did he die here?" Philas also asked. Because of this dash, Brando finally found what he was looking for in the grass, and Halran Gaia was already in his hand. He stabbed down with the sword and immediately nailed the thing to the ground. There was a sharp squeak, and a lump of something black struggled under Brendel's sword for a moment before it died. The others took a closer look and found that it was a weasel-like creature. "What is this?" Philas was slightly startled. "This is a weasel." "You said a weasel killed this guy." The young knight from Cruz widened his eyes exaggeratedly. "Then won't I be killed by my family's hound in the future?" Brando was a little speechless at this analogy, and he felt that with this guy's IQ, if it wasn't for his incredible luck, he might really be killed by a dog. Anyway, being killed by a dog and wound was not a strange thing, and even the duskhound they were going to face in a while was a proper canine. "This is a magic pet," he then replied. "Magic pet?" Philas then reacted, "You mean it was a wizard who killed him, and there are wizards in this tower?" He suddenly felt a little creeped out. The young prince also immediately looked around. Scarlet did not answer, but silently held the azure lance. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 731. Don't be nervous. Brando sighed. Even if there is, it's already dead. This magical pet is ownerless, and it was the spell attached to this magical pet that killed the warrior. I think this guy should have been on the invader's side that day. After the wizard who stayed behind in the wizard tower killed his companion, he should have died as well, but he transferred the last spell to his magical pet and killed this guy. What he said was actually the analysis of the player who had discovered all this, but he turned his head, glanced at Haruz, and asked, "Do you know this guy?" Although he asked this, he felt that it was somewhat unlikely in his heart. How old was Haruz? This skeleton should be at least a century old. But unexpectedly, the young prince frowned, shook his head, and nodded. "I don't know, I seem to have seen this armor somewhere." Armor? Brando looked at the armor. There were no obvious markings on the armor, and the style was very ordinary, but it looked like it should be magic armor. But he took another look and suddenly realized that something was wrong. All this time, he and the player had preconceived that this skeleton was a human, but he suddenly realized a problem. What if this guy didn't become like this after death, but was like this when he was alive? For example, it was a skeleton. A black rose in full bloom on Roman tour. Brando knew at once why the young prince found this skeleton's armor familiar. Because this armor was a very ordinary Aeruan military armor. Such armor was almost everywhere in the kingdom's army, but there was a problem, and that was that all armor should be engraved with the emblem of the army it belonged to. But there was only one exception. That was the skeleton soldiers who had been transformed by the undead. Most of them wore armor that had rusted during their lifetime until they were promoted to skeleton knight or even higher. The lich would have the crypt craftsman smooth out the emblem on their armor and then enchant it with magic. That kind of armor was exactly the same as the one in front of him. But he couldn't be completely sure. He glanced back at the young prince and said, "Madara." When he saw the young prince, he was shocked and nodded vigorously. "Yes, that's the one. I've seen similar armors on their envoys at Winterclaw Fort. I even asked my sister why Madara's armors were the same as ours, that's it." Brando couldn't confirm it himself, but there were some things that he didn't remember better than the natives. If the young prince remembered this, then the possibility was very high. He took a step back and said, "It doesn't matter if it is or not, as long as we check it, we will know. Lady Martha once said that being scattered across the land is a blessing. Warriors should return to their homeland, but the gifts he left behind before his death are rewards for those who come after him. If it's a warrior," he added. Then Brando looked at Faraz, and the young man's eyes lit up. "Yes, that means this armor is our prize. The same goes for the other items. According to our agreement, you will be responsible for organizing the spoils of war," Brando replied. "Ha!" Faraz looked excited. "Yes, I almost forgot if you didn't mention it. Then I'll go." He pointed to the skeleton. Brando nodded. This scene was originally a reward for the players. But he still explained patiently, out of courtesy, "You should start with his luggage, because the priority is to prove the identity of the deceased so that the soul can rest in peace." then the weapons, and finally the armor and other equipment. This was the etiquette of organizing the remains of the dead on the continent, but players never did it. Except for those who played as players with strong spirits, but those were in the minority. And for the natives, this was a rule that had to be obeyed, especially the nobles. The nobles respected the dead quite a bit, so although Madara also believed in Martha, it was not popular in the vast civilized areas for the same reason. I know. Faraz nodded enthusiastically. He squatted down and found that there was a leather pouch that was almost rotten beside the skeleton. He picked up the pouch, but immediately made a soft sound of surprise. "What's wrong?" Brando immediately asked with concern. He had been looking forward to having the luckiest knight in Cruz help him open the body for a long time. "My lord, what do you think this is?" Faraz shook the pouch and pulled out a pale thing from it. At first it looked like a slate, but Brando took a closer look and found that it was a bone. As soon as he saw that thing, he was sure of the other party's identity. Only the undead of Madara would use enchanted bone plates to record text. This information was learned after he went to the Grecius Knight's nation. He took the bone plate and his heart skipped a beat. The text on the bone plate was recorded in Madara's ciphertext. Even he didn't recognize it, but that didn't stop him from using his own light screen to check the properties of the thing. He only saw a line of ghostly green text, unknown bone plate, quest item. Brando was ecstatic. There was no special category for quest items in the Amber Sword. Generally speaking, the things that NPCs issue quests for you to prepare are mostly for other purposes. For example, a blacksmith will ask you to prepare iron ingots, coal, and even tools for him, but these things are also materials in the game and can be used by players. Generally speaking, there is only one kind of thing for writing quest items. That is the item that initiates the hidden quest. Brando's heart was beating wildly. None of the hidden quest rewards in the game were bad. Just like when he saved the Holy Seal Valley before, although the completion of the quest was still a long way from perfect, the reward that Malurcha gave him was a huge surprise. He couldn't help but glance at Faraz in front of him, thinking that it was no wonder he was the legendary existence that stepped on dog shit when he left the house. But seeing that the other party was still looking at him with a puzzled expression, Brando calmed down and replied, "This should be something from Madara. The undead knight often uses similar bone plates to record text. No wonder I saw some strange text on it. Damn it, the first loot is this thing, what bad luck." Faraz cursed and couldn't help but feel a little embarrassed. "Looks like I have bad luck today, why don't you do it?" No need. Brando hurriedly shook his head. What a joke, if he were to do it, he might as well call Maynard up. That night lady's hands were sometimes red and sometimes black, but it was better than him being black all the time. Philas was actually just saying that casually, and then he simply poured out everything in his pocket. With a crash, Brando took a look and almost blacked out. First were 2 rings. 2 dark silver rings, like several silver snakes entwined together, surrounding a cat's eye stone ring. Brando happened to recognize these 2 rings. Double-ringed serpent pupil. Fantasy, defense +1 light resistance +5 light elemental pool +20% double-ringed serpent tooth. Fantasy, defense +1 dark resistance +5 dark elemental pool +20%, all in one, when equipping 1, perception +100, bloodline +100, when equipping 2, dark detection +5. Brando couldn't help but grind his teeth when he saw these 2 things. This pair of rings was a rare set of rings in fantasy equipment. The attributes of this pair of rings themselves were actually not outstanding among fantasy equipment, but the set attributes were really too rare. The increase of dark detection by 5 was an extremely valuable and precious attribute in itself, not to mention the terrifying existence of both perception and bloodline increasing by 100. In fact, bloodline was okay, but perception was a very special attribute in the game. Because perception was not the main attribute of any spell casting or attack, its only function was to improve a person's perception of the world. Basically, in the game, each point of perception could increase one's perception by 2 feet, but this attribute, like intelligence, was very difficult to obtain. Even today, when Brando had elemental activation, his perception attribute was only 50. With his perception, he could roughly clearly hear whispers within 100 meters, as well as normal voices within almost 500 meters, or detect an excellent lurker within 100 or 200 meters. But as long as he wore this pair of rings, within 200 meters, even the top nightingale in the game, who was 10 levels higher than him, would not be able to hide. As long as he deliberately captured it, the sound of a normal conversation within a kilometer could not escape his ears. In addition to hearing, there was also vision. After perception exceeded 100, vision would become magical vision, ignoring darkness, even darkness created by magic. As for the concept of more than 150, it seemed that no one in the game had reached it. Because the all-in-one set of rings was really too difficult to appear, because only the undead would drop this set of rings, but the pupil of the double-ringed snake was a rare light item, so the drop rate was really low. At least Brando had never heard of anyone in the game who had seen this thing. He couldn't help but stare at these 2 rings, almost immediately wanting to pick them up and put them on. But of course, he couldn't do so. First of all, not to mention that it was very rude, and secondly, he couldn't wear it. Because the double-ringed snake ring required at least a wool above the peak of the law. Brando's gaze could only look past this pair of rings and then stop on the 3 items below. A scepter, a mirror with a silver handle, and a tooth. When he saw the scepter, he almost made a gurgling sound in his throat. That thing also had a resounding name, Francis Grip. Curse, Attack, 45-51 Strength plus 200 Constitution-100 Additional Skills. Fade, Francis Blade does not exist in the normal world, so it is difficult for mortals to describe its existence. Unless one was truly hit by the Francis Grip, the Francis Grip would distort the perception of mortals, making it impossible for them to determine how long the blade of the Francis Grip was, be it from sight, hearing, experience, or memory. Rose's thanks, remorse devours the human heart. When using Francis Grip, as long as the wielder has doubts during the battle, then every time he kills an enemy, he will age faster. In the Amber Sword, this sword ushered in a new era. It made players understand the existence of cursed items in the equipment category. But more importantly, this weapon was the only one that caused the user to almost delete his own account. No one knew what the real requirement of Rose's thanks was, but most people only knew one thing. That is, once you take this sword, you can't easily throw it away, and you will lose a level if you use it to kill a person. Cursed items in the game should be legendary equipment corresponding to normal items, and demonic items should be fantasy equipment corresponding to normal items. This sword was a divine artifact on one hand, but Brando would never want to use this thing. P.S. 4th update, 15,000 words, if you didn't see the front, you can flip to the front. I said I would give you a New Year's gift, so I will give you a New Year's gift. New Year's greetings, please send some monthly votes. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Cheetian.com to vote for recommendation and monthly votes. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 733. Brando's gaze went past Francis' grip and stopped on the 4th item. It was a small mirror with a silver handle, and the frame was engraved with a very delicate wavy pattern, a bit like a lady's item. There were hundreds of millions of pieces of equipment in amber, and except for some very famous ones or ones he had used before, it was impossible for him to recognize all of them. He picked up the mirror, and a pale green screen unfolded on the mirror. Reading the words on it, Brando couldn't help but raise his eyebrows slightly. So it's this thing, what's this? As Brando's gaze fell on the small mirror, Philas also noticed the most delicate gadget of all the items. As a noble, he still instinctively prioritized gorgeous appearances. Brando raised the mirror, Valorous dressing mirror. Fantasy, health plus 20 triple/level plus 1 additional skills, the shadow of truth, Valorous dressing mirror duplicates all lies. Using Valorous dressing mirror to select a target can duplicate the previous ability used. This ability will be stored in the mirror in the form of a real illusion. The user can use this ability once and pay 1/10 of its cost. Cooldown time, 1 day, the Goddess of the Night's dressing mirror. This mirror was a very interesting prop in Amber. It could duplicate abilities, but the abilities' use were presented in the form of an illusion. It was just that this illusion was a real illusion. As long as the subject believed that the spell was real, then he had to bear all the corresponding effects. But if he didn't believe it, this spell would be as simple as an illusion to him. Therefore, using this mirror required a lot of skill. If the skills you copied were too bizarre, most people wouldn't believe it. But there were also people who did the opposite and specialized in learning some very exotic skills, for example, swordsmen who learned the skills of elementalists. Often when you didn't believe it, control spells such as Frost Claw would really fall on you. I've heard of this mirror before, but I've never seen it in person. He took the mirror and explained it to Philas. Of course, he did not go into too much detail. He only said that it was a relic left behind by a beautiful female knight, and that the mirror had the ability to replicate illusions. Unexpectedly, his words made the latter's eyes sparkle. He couldn't help but ask, "Wait, I have a presumptuous request. Count, can you give this mirror to me?" Philas might look sloppy on the surface, but deep down, he had received an aristocratic education. In terms of aristocratic etiquette, they had found the skeleton together, but Philas knew very well that this was just Brando doing him a favor. For the nobles, inviting the other party to inspect the spoils of war during a winter hunt was already the highest form of courtesy. Philas was not naive enough to think that he had the right to share these spoils of war. He could see that Brando could find his way here without bringing him along. However, he did not mention the word "buy." In their circle, such a question was undoubtedly very rude and even somewhat insulting. Especially since Brando's current status could be said to be higher than his. Philas' words actually meant that he would return the favor in the future. Brando also heard the implication of this sentence and looked at the other party with some surprise. He did not understand why this mirror was so important to the other party that he needed to repay it with a favor. After all, the higher one's status, the less one liked to owe people favors. Philas himself was just an apprentice knight, but don't forget that he would become a prince of the Cruz Empire in the future. Seeing that Brando was a little confused, Philas then explained, "Count, you mentioned that this was a relic of a beautiful lady when she was alive. I feel that it must be worthy of Lorena, and I've always wanted to give her a gift. So that's how it is." Brendel finally reacted. He did not expect this guy to be so romantic. He looked at the silver mirror in his hand. To be honest, this thing was a good magical artifact. Even if he used it himself, it would be of great use. But on the other hand, it was indeed a good choice to gain the favor of Lorena and Philas. He had offended a lot of people in the Cruz Empire, especially the killing of Williams, although Wood had covered it up and described it as the deputy commander's death under a sneak attack by a demon. But these statements could only fool the general public. Williams himself was a descendant of a large family in the Cruz Empire, and his relatives and best friends were all powerful people at the time. Even if they did not trouble him for a while, it was inevitable that they would have malice against him behind his back. Not to mention the recent inexplicable addition of the Prime Minister's daughter to the blacklist. Brando had never seen the Prime Minister's daughter in Amber, but the famous Prime Minister of the Empire was a very influential figure in the game. And his faction was very different from William's Temple faction, which meant that he had offended the two major forces of the Empire at the same time. So he had to consider winning over the moderates in the Empire. After all, a sage in Erewhon had once said that when it came to the politics of Erewhon, the Empire and the Wind Elves couldn't be avoided. Although this was somewhat helpless, it was a true portrayal of this ancient kingdom. Not to mention that the princess's party had not yet unified Erewhon. Even if they were fully fledged, the geography of Erewhon made it impossible for Brando to completely separate the kingdom from the influence of the Cruz Empire and the Wind Elves. Although he kept saying that he wanted to break with the Holy Cathedral of Fire, Brando was actually very clear in his heart. Before Erewhon really became an empire, the best choice was to remain neutral between the Holy Cathedral of Wind and the Holy Cathedral of Fire. His opinion also came from that sage. The sage's name was Valadarin, and he was Tumen's teacher in the mortal world. He was an important minister of the kingdom for nearly 100 years, from the establishment of the Corvado dynasty and the ascension of White King Edward to Anson XI. He was also the founder of the Renaissance era. If it was said that Tumen and his own grandfather Darius were under the shadow of this sage. Brando's promise to help Veronica was not without this consideration, and the families of Lorena and Filas also had considerable influence in Cruz. The key was that Filas' family and Vahina's family had a good relationship, and if he could rope in these two families at the same time, the empire would have the power to counterbalance those potential enemies. Of course, the most important point was Brando had a good impression of Filas and Lorena. Although both of them were descendants of great nobles, they did not act arrogantly. Compared to these two, he had to wonder about the family education of the so-called Prime Minister of the Empire and the Archduke of Flower Leaf. Fortunately, although Vahina was rude, she was not bad in nature. He really didn't dare to compliment the Prime Minister's daughter. Brendel had always believed that personal character could determine many things. If Firas and Lorena were the same as those unsightly nobles, no matter how powerful the families behind them were in Kurlutz, he would probably not give them a second glance. Although he had long said goodbye to everything about his past, Brando had always maintained the last line of arrogance and pride of a gamer in his heart. Otherwise, if he could compromise, he would not have gotten into so much trouble today. After all, Erewhon had nothing to do with him. He glanced at Filas and threw the mirror over. "You are guests, I am the host, and it is only right for the host to give gifts to the guests, no need to be so polite. Besides, these things are ownerless to begin with, and maybe Lady Lorena is the owner it has chosen." "That's true." Filas' eyes lit up, "But Count, you are really the most generous gentleman I have ever met. Please come to the Cruz Empire when you have the chance, and I will definitely treat you as my most distinguished guest." Brendel smiled faintly. This guy was basically treating him as someone worth befriending. But he nodded without too much concern. This was just an opportunity. To truly form a close relationship, benefits were still needed. But he had plenty of opportunities, so he was not in a hurry for the moment. Brando had the idea of developing the Black Forest. The Black Forest had the most precious goods in all of Wonde, and with specialties that were hard to come by, he did not believe that the nobles of Cruz could sit still. Even the nobles of the empire had to feed their families, and the larger the family, the more shocking the expenses. Which nobles of the empire did not have their own properties? Especially the upper class of Cruz, who pursued an extravagant lifestyle. When the time came, the things in his hands would definitely arouse their interest. Filas indeed had the spirit of a scion of a large family. As a noble, he certainly understood the value of the goddess of the night's dressing mirror, but when he put away the mirror, it was as if he was putting away an ordinary mirror. Then he looked at the other things on the ground and asked, "Count, you should also recognize these things, don't you?" Brando nodded slightly and introduced him to the ring of the double-ringed serpent and the grasp of Francis one by one. But of course, he did not go into that much detail. He only pointed out the approximate value and history of these two magic items. In fact, he knew very well that nobles like Filas would not be very interested in the practical use of these things. Instead, the background of these magic items was more attractive to them. After telling the story of the grasp of Francis, that unjust knight, Brando's eyes fell on the last item. It was the tooth he saw before. It looked a bit like a wolf's fang, but when Brando took a closer look, he found that it was actually a bone dragon's tooth. This was an incredible item. The bone dragon's tooth was one of the most precious materials in amber. Using it to cast armor could give one the special ability to resist the curse of aging. Embedding it into a weapon could give the weapon the special power of the curse of aging. In his previous life, the price of a bone dragon's tooth was as high as hundreds of thousands of tor each. Brando had tried his best to get one, but at that time, the weapon made from this thing was not very useful to him, because it was recognized in amber that it was most suitable for players with the time element. The reason was simple. The triggering rate of the curse of aging provided by the bone dragon's tooth ranged from a minimum of 1% to a maximum of 2.5%. Depending on the effect of the forging, the triggering rate could be said to be quite low. This triggering rate was somewhat useless for the average player, but it was different for players with the time element, because having the time element meant having the active elemental effect of a lapse. The active elemental effect of a lapse was described as long as the lines of law tend to be stable, the user's attack can affect the enemy and cause them to age rapidly. In fact, it was actively triggering the curse of aging. And this effect could be stacked with the effect of the bone dragon's tooth itself, which meant that with the bone dragon's tooth, when the elapse effect was turned on, the curse of aging was basically doubled. As one of the few high-grade items that he had experienced in his previous life, Brando had always remembered the effect of this thing. And here, he had the spacetime attribute that was one level higher than the time element. It was as if this thing was specially made for him. When he picked up the tooth, the look in Faraz' eyes couldn't help but soften a little. This was simply the god of fortune. If he brought this guy with him every time he went into a dungeon, wouldn't it not be long before he could graduate with godly equipment? Of course, he also knew that this was just wishful thinking, and that Faraz and Lorena were unlikely to stay in Erewhon forever. Presumably, as soon as Erek died, they and Veronica would return to the Cruz Empire. This is a bone dragon's tooth. Faraz seemed to recognize the thing in Brando's hand. Brando was slightly taken aback and a little surprised. You know it? I've probably heard of it, Faraz replied with a little pride. I heard that this thing was a tooth taken from a humorous WIRM in Madara, right? No. Before Brando could speak, Haruz interrupted him and said in a childish voice, the humorous WIRM in Madara is just a monster assembled from the bones of a WIRM. The real undead WIRM is a dead adult dragon, and only a few WIRMs in Woned have been transformed into undead. Their power is almost the same as when they were alive, and even His Majesty the Emperor with the Mercury staff respects them. Brando shifted his gaze to the little prince, whose face was slightly red, his soft curly hair sticking to his forehead, and his eyes shining in the dark against the light of the illuminating crystal, looking very feminine. But he still insisted, my sister told me this. Your sister, Princess Griffin. Faraz reacted. My sister said that Madara is Erewhon's mortal enemy. Although you Cruz people have been trying to manipulate the power of the kingdom, you won't let the kingdom fall into a sea of fire. But for the undead, the boundary between life and death is easy to break. Haruz looked at Faraz as if he was holding his breath. But I've always wondered, we're all humans, why can't we work together to deal with those monsters in the dark? Well. Faraz was a little embarrassed and couldn't help but scratch his hair. Brando looked at the guy with some sympathy, and he couldn't explain to Haruz that Madara's skeletons were not, strictly speaking, monsters. After all, the undead were also part of this world, and they were not truly immortal, but just another way of existing. In fact, in Woned, the undead of Madara, like the humans of Cruz and the wind elves of Saint Ossul, all believed in Martha, who symbolized order. It was just that one worshipped the order of darkness, and the other had a heart towards the light. But it couldn't be said that Princess Griffin was wrong. The boundary between life and death was very fragile, but the two were, after all, very different existences. The undead had invaded the eastern part of Erewhon for thousands of years, and there were many examples like Butchie. As a human, it was really difficult to think of things from the perspective of the undead. He sighed and rubbed the little prince's hair. "Did your sister tell you all this?" Lady Maynard also said some. This was similar to what Brando had guessed. But he didn't intend to continue on this topic, and patted the little prince on the shoulder. Then he turned around and pulled the armor from the skeleton with a crash, tearing the already decaying skeleton apart. "Mr. Brando, you..." Faraz was startled, and Scarlet, who had been standing at the back, also stared at her lord in surprise. The mountain people, like the nobles, had great respect for the undead. But Brando looked at the armor and explained, "As you can see, the average person wouldn't carry a bone plate with words on it or a sword with a curse. There's only one kind of existence that would use them." Faraz was slightly startled, but reacted quickly. "Wait, my lord, you mean..." Brando nodded. He could basically confirm that this thing was a skeleton when it was alive. It was more likely a skeleton knight. He had been influenced by the player's strategy guide, but now that he thought about it, the strategy guide was a very early product. Things like the bone plate of the secret runes were only known to everyone in the later stages of the game when the status of the players in the game gradually increased. Therefore, it was entirely possible that the strategy guide had overlooked something. This reminded him that because of the different time periods, some strategies were likely to have limitations, and he himself had to come up with his own experience to judge. Brando handed the armor in his hand to Faraz. "This is a set of enchanted armor. The magic armor of the skeleton knight has no special power, but its defense is shockingly high. Take it and put it on later, there won't be just demonic spirits from here onward." Faraz frowned at the dirty, dusty armor in Brando's hand. Magic armor was a very rare and precious magic item even in Amber, and he certainly knew that. But for him to wear something that had just been pulled out of a dead person, it was really a little. Faraz swallowed and replied dryly, "Well, I'll find a way to wash it." In fact, he also knew that he was basically the weakest existence in the team on this trip. Brando gave him the armor so that he wouldn't be such a burden to the team in the future. But in any case, he gave Brando a grateful look, and then took the smelly armor with a bitter face. Brando turned back again, and he estimated that it should be almost time outside, so he quickened the movements of his hands. This time he pulled out the skeleton knight's weapon from the pile of broken bones, a flame-shaped sword. As soon as he pulled the sword out, Haruz behind him couldn't help but let out a cry. "What's the matter?" Faraz, who was now very familiar with the little prince, immediately asked. This is the lion's tooth." Brando looked at the sword in his hand with some appreciation, and said with some surprise, "It was the sword of the guard of the late King Eric, and the method of forging it has long been lost for hundreds of years. It seems that the identity of our Mr. Knight has some history, yeah." Haruz nodded heavily. "Is there something wrong with this sword?" Faraz looked at Haruz's sparkling eyes and couldn't help but be a little curious. "No, it's very appropriate." Brando raised the sword under the faint light of the illuminating crystal and smiled slightly. The 11 knights of the late King Eric were all people who shone brightly for a time. "Oh, by the way, do you see the knight beside Freya who hasn't made a sound or made a move?" Faraz nodded inexplicably. Of course he saw the Knight of the Lake who had been outside the crowd. "They're all legends," Brando sighed as he turned the blade and handed the hilt to Haruz. He smiled at the little Prince of Erewhon and asked, "What do you think?" Haruz stared blankly at the Count's actions. Count, you're giving it to me." He was almost in disbelief. The historical texts say that the lion's tooth belongs to the truly brave. In your previous battle, you may not have been an excellent warrior. But those who can overcome themselves are true warriors, Brendel replied. "Are you saying that it's not worthy of you?" "Your Highness Haruz." "No. I just..." Haruz was surprised and a little excited. His eyes were as beautiful as silver gems, and he couldn't help but blush. But this is a hero's sword. I just think, you just think you're not worthy of it. Brando shook his head. If you think you need to be braver, then all the more you should pick up this sword and prove yourself. Besides, you're not just going to prove yourself for a sword. Brando handed the sword to him. This is your trophy. Legend has it that the mountain men are declared adults when they get their weapons, so this sword is your responsibility from now on. As Brando said this, he looked up and saw Scarlet nodding slightly at him not far away. I understand, Count, this was Haru's almost inaudible voice. P.S. Today's 6,000 words. Boo-hoo, looks like I'm going out again tomorrow, I'll see. So annoying. Fortunately, it's over on the 15th. This year has been a nightmare, and I'll continue to ask for monthly votes. To be continued. If you like this work, you're welcome to come to Chidien. Come to vote for recommendation and monthly votes. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 734. After confirming that there was nothing more valuable in the Skeleton Knight's broken bones, Brando put away the equipment and did not intend to move forward. From here, there was a greenhouse garden, where the wizard destroyed the portal, causing space-time turbulence. Further ahead was the labyrinth area, where there were some scattered equipment, but the gains did not make up for the losses. They went back the way they came, went back to the second floor and returned to the hall, just in time to meet the Shire and Medisha, who were returning from outside the wizard tower for the third time. At this time, there were only a few demonic spirits in the forest. Looking out from the tower, there were only a few clusters of light in the darkness, as if there were only a few lanterns left. Brando used telepathy to call the Shire and Medisha to his side. After a series of battles, the Shire looked a little tired, but Medisha's spirit was still good. This was because the endurance of a low-level warrior was much higher than that of a spellcaster. However, Medisha's silver-gray elven plate armor had obvious traces of burning magic, and there was also a bloodstain on her snow-white face. My lord. My lord. Both of them saw Brando and respectfully greeted him. Brando did not answer. He used his hand to draw in front of Medisha and Brando. 2 light green light screens appeared. Before entering the tower, the Shire and Medisha were both level 27, but now they were close to level 32, which was equivalent to jumping from the unstable early silver to the middle silver level. This speed was quite fast. You did well. Brendel smiled faintly. It's all thanks to my lord's discovery of this tower. Medisa replied softly with a courteous smile. Hey, the Shire sighed and seemed a little curious, but my lord should have known that there was a high-level exorcism array here, otherwise why did you seem so confident before? This guy's curiosity always seemed to overflow, but the key was that he was also very shrewd, always noticing some details that others did not notice. Brando put on a straight face. The Black Tower wizards would not build a pavilion here for viewing. You're not wrong to put it that way. I just thought for a while, there seems to be no more suitable defensive facility than the high-level exorcism array here. It's like it was tailor-made for us. That kind of feeling is really too comfortable. How is it, Medisha, do you feel that way? The Shire asked as he looked back, secretly glancing at Brando from the corner of his eyes. Well, a little. Medisha nodded gently. But the young wizard's sneaky look made Brando a little dumbfounded. Not only Brando, but even the young prince looked at him in bewilderment, wondering if the chief wizard under his teacher had taken the wrong medicine today. Because you're also a member of the Black Tower. This proves that all outstanding defenders have the same way of thinking, unless you think you're an idiot. Brendel stared at him, tapped his forehead, and said, because you're also a member of the Black Tower. This proves that all outstanding defenders have the same way of thinking. Unless you think you're an idiot. I see. The Shire could not help but be convinced by his lord's words. But he immediately thought of a new problem. But wait, now I don't seem to be. before he could finish, Medisha stepped on his foot. Brando and the Silver Elf Princess both understood that this guy wanted to blurt out that he was already a silver-robed mage, but how could these words be said without thinking? After all, this was not a game where one could change professions at will, and if news of a silver-robed mage having a close relationship with the Bugas got out, it might cause some trouble. Brando glared fiercely at the guy, who knew he was in the wrong, and smiled awkwardly, scratching his head and not saying a word. The remaining 3 people thought that the young prince was ignorant and might have doubts in his heart, but he would not necessarily say it out loud, even in front of his sister. Philas did not notice these details at all. He was admiring the dressing mirror of the goddess of the night from beginning to end. As for Scarlet, maybe she saw it, maybe she didn't. Even Brando sometimes did not know what this mountain girl was thinking. "My lord, there are not many demonic spirits outside. Why don't you order everyone to kill their way out now? After cleaning up the battlefield, we can still move forward a little. Haven't we already wasted a lot of time in the Ansera forest?" Medisha spoke softly at the right time, avoiding the topic. Brando nodded. He thought that the most reliable person around him, besides Amandina, was probably the Silver Elf Princess. But it was time to move on. Medisha was right, they had wasted too much time in the Ansera forest, and now they had to seize every minute and every second. So he immediately ordered the Shire and Medisha to gather everyone. In fact, it was mainly the Knight of the Guard and the original entourage of the convoy. These people were mostly the princess's elites, and had been resting in the hall for quite some time. They were already ready to go, so they immediately acted when the order was given. Before leaving, Brando still had the Shire recall the wizard tower to its original position. Although the tower could not be moved, it could be sold to the Black Tower wizards in the future as a favor. As everyone knew, wizards were not short of money. The battle in the forest had actually come to an end long ago. The combination of Freya and Hippamra, who were still outside, was just looking for some fish that had slipped through the net in the woodland. Most of the others' tasks were to clean up the battlefield. Demonic spirits were extremely disgusting monsters in Amber. For players, difficult monsters were not necessarily disgusting. But monsters that were difficult to deal with and stingy with their drops must be extremely disgusting. There was no doubt about this, and demonic spirits happened to be on the list of such monsters. The facts also proved this point. Hundreds of demonic spirits, and the only thing that could be seen in the end were 2 pieces of chaos fragments. The name of this thing sounded very mighty and domineering, but in fact, it was a condensation of dark magic, an uncommon alchemy material of little use. But it was better than nothing, wasn't it? Brando thought that the person leading the team to clean up the battlefield was Maynard, and his heart was relieved. But what scared him a little was that Lorena's hands were even darker than Maynard's. It seemed that history could not be trusted, and the knight couple's good luck was all thanks to Faraz. He looked at Lorena, then looked at Maynard, and immediately marked a woman who was a knight with a dark label in his heart. He took one last look at Freya, who was resting in the distance, and made up his mind that he would never let the Valkyrie open corpses in the future. After the demonic spirits in the abyssal pool had been purged, the team was finally able to move on. It was already late at night in the forest, but the actual time Brando's copper watch still showed that it was just afternoon. He planned to camp in the middle of the night and cross the atrium before today. After passing through the forest, the terrain on both sides began to open up. According to the description in the guide, Brando recognized that this was the area in the first half of the atrium. Sure enough, traces of dusk hounds began to appear in the forest. This was a creature similar to a wolf and a fox. It was larger than a black wolf and had 5 fingers on its claws. Legend had it that it was the ancestor of all wolf-shaped monsters. Before Akis, the demon wolf Fenrir was a dusk hound. Dusk hounds were a typical gregarious monster in Amber. Their special abilities were teleportation and blink, and they also had the ability to spit. Its spit ability was Breath of Dusk. Creatures hit by breath of dusk would be permanently petrified, which was a rather terrifying ability. But dusk hounds were not without weaknesses. In amber, monsters with strong offense and flexibility tended to be weak in defense, and the same was true for dusk hounds. Their blink and teleportation had nowhere to hide from the law wizard's dimensional anchor spells. The only thing that was difficult to determine was where they would appear first, and where the dimensional anchor would be. But this was not a problem for Brando. In the first half of the atrium, they were attacked by a small group of dusk hounds. According to Brando's judgment, there were about 7 to 8 adult individuals in the pack, and twice the number of mothers and young individuals. The ecology of monsters was very strange. They had some of the characteristics of beasts, but the way they reproduced was not exactly the same. In short, lairs were still very important to monsters. As soon as the group of dusk hounds appeared, Brando noticed them. Before everyone else, even before the monsters themselves. The dusk hound's range of activity was very regular. He had dealt with them in the Kalanga Mountains, and not for a short period of time. For almost half a year, he and his senior sister had been fighting these beasts. So from the traces of magic flow in the forest, he detected the presence of the dusk hounds. The second to discover these beasts was Maynard. At that time, the dusk hounds had already begun to track them. As if out of instinct, the female knight reacted. Brando noticed that she looked behind, that was the direction where the monsters were. Then, Brando ordered the team to stop and let the Shire set up the dimensional anchor. Just when everyone was puzzled, the dusk hounds came, and as if they had agreed in advance, they broke into the traps set by the Shire. As for the battle after that could be described as one-sided. After losing the ability to blink and switch between dimensions to dodge attacks and teleport away from danger, the brittle dusk hounds were simply the best targets. Although they still had the ability to spit, the clumsy spit was actually not the best weapon against a warrior. After a few rounds, the entire dusk hounds were killed. These monsters with the combat strength of a beginner gold just became the EXP of Brando, the Shire, and the others. After this experience, the others quickly got into the zone. They slowly passed through the valley under Brando's command. Along the way, they were attacked several times by the dusk hounds. However, Brando did the same, and the battle was even simpler than before. This went on until the Shire exhausted all his spells. Then, Brando asked him to quietly summon the Ether Dragon to restore his magic power and stop the whole team. Because of the continuous killing of monsters that were of a higher level, the Shire's silver-robed mage was already level 34 at this time, while Metasha and Hippamra were level 33. Because they had been suppressing their strength in front of others, the people around them did not realize the fact that their strength was slowly increasing. After all, the Shire and Metasha were originally gold rankers around Brando. Even if they hid their strength, others would not think too much about it. However, Brando asked the team to stop because they were already at the end of the atrium. In other words, the leader-tier dusk hound was probably nearby. P.S. I came back a little late, but I still insisted on writing a chapter. Everyone, please bear with it. After the 15th, your 10,000 strong baboons per day will be back. Continue to ask for monthly votes. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 735. The ruins, immersed in the darkness, showed a special greenish-gray color under the light of the gemstone, which was the unique color of basalt. Among the many ethnic groups in Wonde, only the Myernas liked to build majestic buildings with this special igneous rock. The ruins stood quietly in the woodland, and the guard knight passed through the forest of basalt pillars and dragged the body of a huge pine bear with a rope through its ribs to the center of the camp in the middle of the ruins. A pile of corpses was piled up like a hill. The team had encountered these uninvited guests half an hour ago. Pine bears belonged to a category of devil beasts, which the Cruise people called ferocious beasts. They were creatures between monsters and animals, unlike monsters whose magic dissipated after death, leaving only crystals, so they became the best food reserved for Brando and his party. Their luck was pretty good. After entering the Evernight Forest, there were basically no living animals, except for the occasional lost small animal. There were no large carnivorous beasts in the Ancera Forest, and this group of pine bears should have come from the north of Lantern Island. They strayed into the forest, eroded by the dark magic, and attacked Brando and his party in a frenzy. Brando knew that pine bears were actually very gentle carnivorous beasts, and they usually only hunted large herbivores. For example, the deer herds on the north shore of Crystal Lake, or an artiodactyl herbivore the size of a hippopotamus. But they rarely attacked humans. The peeled pine bear fur was rolled up and thrown aside, and Peya took the initiative to take on the task, which was a familiar task for the huntress. Peya used a skinning knife to make an incision from the spine and then turned it over. The hunter's skinning knife was passed down from generation to generation, and the blade was slightly curved, with a long and narrow edge, like a silver ruler. She made the incision to the tailbone, then spread it out on both sides, and in less than 10 minutes she peeled off a complete piece of bear skin. Brando looked back after a while, holding a transparent crystal like bright yellow amber in his hand, which was the magic crystal left behind by the Dusk Hound. It was larger than the Black Wolf and contained more magic, but Brando's face was not at all satisfied. He stared at the messy lair of a few sharp white rocks not far in front of him. This should be the Dusk Hound's lair, but now, only ruins were left. Someone beat him to it, but he didn't know if it was a wreck or Cruise's men. In the distance, Maynard and Freya were walking over the broken stones. The female knight shook her head and said, "I didn't find any valuable clues. They didn't camp here. After destroying the nest, they left to the north. There are traces of battle nearby, but the scale isn't large. Perhaps there's another possibility." The Dusk Hounds weren't able to react in time before they were wiped out by the other side. Dusk Hounds are very vigilant. However, it seems like they came from another direction. Maynard thought for a moment and said, "It's very likely. There's no way I wouldn't have noticed any clues before. These people shouldn't have taken the same path as us. I trust your judgment. But do you think it's a wreck or Cruise's men?" Brando's "I trust your judgment" made Maynard raise her head slightly and look at him with some surprise. "It's very likely to be a wreck. Cruise's men entered the forest from Fort Valendon and shouldn't have deviated from this direction. But we can't rule out other possibilities. Count, will there be adventurers in this forest?" "Occasionally, there will be some." Maynard looked up at the direction of the forest thoughtfully. Freya whispered, "Brando, should we continue?" "No need. A wreck is only a week ahead of us in the Ancera Forest. He won't be more familiar with the forest than we are. If they didn't take the same route as us, then we've been chasing them for almost a day." Brando actually didn't want to meet a wreck too early, because a wreck shouldn't know that they were behind him yet, and it would be good to let the other party run into him. Besides, Maynard's previous words reminded him that if there were no signs of a large-scale battle in the forest, he suspected that the leader of the Dusk Hounds might still be wandering in the forest. "Let's set up camp," he said. "The vastness of the Black Forest is difficult for ordinary people to understand. Let everyone have a good rest. This time, I'm afraid it won't be a matter of a day or two." Freya looked at him and nodded obediently. Dinner was a sumptuous pine bear feast, and the cooks were the Shire and Peya. According to Charles himself, he had been a gourmet when he was alive and had traveled to many regions just to learn and record the local food culture. Peya, on the other hand, had all the qualities that a child from a poor family should have. She was hardworking, tenacious, clever, and could handle her prey with ease. Bear soup, roasted bear meat, and a warm bonfire brought a trace of warmth to the silent and cold night. Brando asked Hippamrit to set up a sound and smell barrier to prevent attracting more monsters in the forest. The Shire called it the dinner in the forest. It was said that Mglyn, the fairy king of the Elantakanoth Peninsula, often entertained guests in the forest. It was the night fairies who would light up all kinds of magic lamps in the forest, like an open-air palace. That was how the dinner in the forest got its name. The young wizard's analogy was agreed by everyone. Although they couldn't drink to their heart's content, everyone still praised the sumptuous food. The dinner in the forest came to an end after about 8 or 9 o'clock, and the ruins quickly fell silent. The knight from the Royal Knight Order was Erewhon's most outstanding soldier, and naturally, it was impossible for them to be as undisciplined as the average noble's private army. Only the red flames, dancing shadows, and the knight on night duty were left in the camp. Brando especially liked the bonfire in the dark. The bright light of the fire seemed to dispel the darkness and coldness in people's hearts. Whenever he sat by the bonfire and looked at the outline of the ground outlined by the dancing flames, he couldn't help but think of his days in the game. Compared with the general dullness of adventurers, the players always had no taboos. His senior sister would sometimes propose to hold some small activities, and these episodes were always accompanied by laughter. Whenever Brando recalled a few interesting experiences, he couldn't help but smile knowingly on his face. Medisha put her hand on the title page of a red-covered book and quietly looked at her lord. Sometimes she could often see a look of reminiscence on Brando's face. But she never asked much, and could only secretly think that it must be quite a warm memory. Medisha also had some warm memories. Since her soul returned to this world, she often remembered everything in the past. But memory was a painful process for the undead. She remembered her sister, mother, father, and her soul seemed to be stripped away. The dark magic always tempted her to think about the question she had been unwilling to face. There seemed to be a voice whispering in her ear in the darkness, "Why was it you who was sacrificed? You should have had better memories. Do you remember everything that happened after the War of the Holy Saints? No, you can't remember, because you never had the memory after that. You were born in war and died in war. You have never experienced peaceful days in your life, so how can you understand the happiness of mortals?" But the little silver elf princess just buried these negative emotions in her heart, then raised her head and faced her future with a smile. She looked at Brando, her eyes shining with both yearning and admiration. It was as if she could find her own ordinariness in this lord. Brando seemed to have finally noticed the gaze of the little elven princess, and he was slightly startled. Then he saw the book in Medisha's hand, which was a folklore and geography of the Cruz and Jingwan areas. Since reintegrating into human society, Medisha had been showing interest in today's human society, but Brando knew that she was actually learning how to integrate with others. She always prioritized thinking from the perspective of others. "Is there anything you don't understand?" Brando asked softly. 1,000 years ago and even now, the way the Silver Elves thought was very different from that of humans. Sometimes Medisha couldn't understand some human words and had to ask him for help. Medisha suddenly felt that her lord was a little cute, and she made a soft sound with a nasal voice. "I don't quite understand why the people in Jingwan would send lilies to their sweetheart on the day of the Midsummer Festival. What's the symbolic meaning of this?" Brando froze for a moment, not expecting this question. Although Medisha was a princess and an important general of the Silver Elves, she still had a young girl's side. He thought for a moment and replied, "Because in the legends of the mountain people, midsummer represents blazing and unrestrained, just like the blooming of love. Since the long dark ages, people have thought that the Midsummer Festival is a festival that belongs to the trade winds. The sailors think that the trade winds represent the transmission of longing, and I think there may be a certain connection. The elves are different." Medisha replied softly, "The elves think that this is a kind of mutual protection, and even if time stretches on, it can't penetrate. It's like a distant song in the dark forest, lingering in the heart. That's because human life is so short, and they can't understand the meaning of the word time. For mortals, using a short period of time to burst out a blazing light, even if it's a fleeting flash, is enough to attract respect. The elves understand the meaning of waiting because of their long lives, but mortals are also clumsily going back and forth in the cycle of history. Time is parallel in two ways, and it seems that summer insects can't talk about ice, but how can a long time understand the beauty of the short? Is that so? Medisha closed the book and tilted her head. My lord, can I lean on you for a moment? Brando hesitated for a moment. He saw that Medisha was a little quiet, and finally nodded. The silver elf princess's tone was like a feather, so soft that it was impossible to refuse. Moreover, she never asked for much, and left people with the best impression. Then, he felt a soft body press against him. Medisha showed a knowing smile, as if she remembered the time when she was next to her mother. At that time, my mother would tell me the stories of the heroes, and my biggest wish was to be like them. But now I just want to be a normal person. Thank you, my lord. Medisha said in an inaudible voice. P.S. Today's it's been 2 days, please bear with it. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Calm to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 736. In the second half of the night, the wind seemed to be blowing in the forest, and the sound of the wind was like the mythical wolves running at dusk, whistling through the canopy, rustling, and causing the wind and rain to blow. Peya had long been used to curling up in the shadows of the tent alone. Since the upheaval, she had not dared to sleep easily, and the nightmares of that day seemed to reappear in every dream. She saw her brother covered in blood walking in front of her, followed by a shadowy and obscure shadow half asleep. The flickering candles suddenly went out. Only nobles could afford to light expensive suet candles in every tent, but after the sudden disappearance of the light, the darkness seemed to stretch. The four walls of the tent were engulfed in thick darkness, and there seemed to be light in the distance again. The hunter girl blinked some of her heavy eyelids and saw that she was in a shadowy forest. The forest was hazy, as if there were gray double shadows. She heard a distant song and could not help but look up and see a line of glowing ghosts in white robes walking slowly through the forest. Some of the ghosts were wearing robes, some were riding warhorses, some were holding spears, some were holding swallow-tailed flags, and everyone's face was clear. Some of them seemed to be familiar to her, but some felt strange to her. She suddenly saw a short figure walking in the group, his head bowed. It was her brother Yeruda. Yeruda! Peya could not help but scream. She could not care about anything else in her heart and immediately ran in that direction. But the forest became thicker and thicker, and the complex roots seemed to grow, tripping her. She looked up and saw her brother's back in despair as he walked further and further away. Yeruda! Peya! A firm voice came from outside the dream. The hunter girl felt as if someone had grabbed her hand, and the scenery around her faded quickly, and a warm light seeped into the darkness from all directions. She opened her eyes abruptly and found herself standing in the middle of the camp, sweating and pale as a sheet. Brando was standing in front of her, holding her arm, and in front of her was the campfire. Peya leaned forward slightly, as if she was about to rush into the fire. What's the matter with you? Brando frowned. He and Medisha saw the huntress rush out of the tent with a blank expression and crash into the bonfire without hesitation. If it wasn't for his quick reflexes, she would have been severely burned. Only now did he realize that the other party seemed to be sleepwalking. Nightmares again. The hunter maiden would wake up every night. For Brando, who had to keep watch for a while every day, he naturally knew. Peya stared at him blankly, as if she could not react for a moment. Her hair was messy and stuck to her completely soaked forehead. Her dark brown eyes were glistening with tears, as if she had not recovered from the previous nightmare. Sir Knight. Peya froze for a moment, hurriedly withdrew her hand, and lowered her head with some trepidation. I'm sorry. In the strict hierarchy, how could a vulgar hunter's daughter like her touch a noble's body so easily? Nobles were the descendants of sages. They were glorious, and noble, and disdained the company of the untouchables. In some places, civilians would be punished for approaching nobles without permission. In Lob, civilians who came within 10 feet of a noble's carriage would be whipped. In the early days, this was a means to guard against assassins. But in modern times, it gradually evolved into a unique privilege. Brando was slightly startled, and then reacted. He shook his head. As I said, if it's because of my noble status, you don't have to apologize to it. Some people value it because they have nothing but it. He is proud of the title that society has given him, and I have ideals and pursuits that I am proud of. Miss Peya, I let you stay in this group only because you are our guide. If possible, I will help you find your brother's whereabouts, he said, so much just to appease the other party. Peya calmed down as expected. She glanced at the lord somewhat cautiously. She had heard Faraz, Lorena, and the other knights call him Lord Count. She could not imagine what kind of high and mighty existence the Count was. The most prestigious person in Shallow Water Town was just an old knight. But the Count was undoubtedly a strange man. She had never seen such a nobleman without heirs. Thank you, Lord Knight. I had a nightmare again. You didn't look like a nightmare just now. What exactly did you see? Peya was a little puzzled, but she recounted her dream. A white ghost. What's the matter? Medisha stood up and asked softly. She looked at the somewhat serious look on Brando's face and felt that things might be a little strange. Interesting. Brando raised his head and looked at the sharp canopy of the pine forest swaying in the wind. At first, he thought it was a sea and land breeze blowing from the direction of the Sea of the Dead Moon, but now it seemed that was not the case. The last time I told you about the lost knight, Peya, you are from the Manowir area. Have you heard of the legend of the lost man? The lost man. Well, a nameless person's name is a name, and a name is like a code. It is meaningless in itself, but it is a mark that other people have for you. The Myrna people have some dark legends. If someone loses his name, he or she will become a wandering ghost. Simply put, abandoned by the civilized world, the elves have a similar saying, because people need each other. If a person loses his due reputation, then the value of his existence is very weak. The legend of the ghosts in the forest has a long history. The knight who lost his reputation was abandoned by people. They fell into darkness, lost themselves, and muttered to themselves all day long. They were already dead, but their memories lingered in the forest all day long. If someone was confused, they would be tempted by them. Hunters often saw the lost knight in the forest, but that was just the fear of the unknown in their hearts. Brando looked at the wind surging over the forest, which seemed to be strong enough to push the clouds away. But there was still no light behind the clouds, which did not make sense, because it was not the wind, but the great uneasiness that shrouded everyone's hearts. This uneasiness came from the turmoil of the whole world. Brando saw a pale blue arc of light on the horizon. He had thought that it was the faint light gathering outside the horizon line to form the horizon, but now it seemed that there was only one reasonable explanation left. The second mana tide was coming. What a coincidence. Medisha, go and get the others up. I'm afraid this forest won't be so safe later. We have to find a way to get through the wall of sighs before then. The things in the forest may give us some trouble, my lord. The camp seemed to come alive. In just 10 minutes, the pale blue horizon on the horizon grew a claw-like shape in this direction. The wind seemed to come alive, and the wind roared, rolling up countless branches and leaves, converging into a black river. Specks of light appeared in the forest, which was a sign that the magic power drifting in the main material world was skyrocketing. After a period of turmoil and chaos, everyone finally gathered together. Brando counted everyone, and after making sure that no one was left behind, he looked back at Maynard, who was staring at the horizon with a gloomy expression. "I seem to have seen it there," she muttered to herself. Brando knew that she had indeed experienced it, but those memories had long been scattered into pieces. He did not know how many memories she still had of that time. But Maynard seemed to have thought of something, and she looked back at Brando. "Brando, do you know something? Let's talk about this later." Brando looked at the forest that seemed to have suddenly become earth-shaking. This mana tide was the second mana tide recorded in history. The warlocks of the Tower of Stars and Moon recorded this mana tide, which was earlier than history, about 3 months earlier. Although it was not clear what this meant, the outside world must have fallen into extreme panic. The second mana tide crossed the border of the Land of Order, affecting Erewhon, the south of Cruz, Eloranta, and some areas around the Great Glacier. The literature recorded that many places at that time observed solar eclipses, day turning to night, mana tide, and similar phenomena. Brando was a little worried about Amandina and the Roman, but he believed that they should be able to handle the matters in the territory. Fortunately, Cruz should be on their side now, otherwise it would not be easy to deal with the Holy Cathedral of Fire at this juncture. "My lord, what should we do now?" A knight came up and asked respectfully. Brando glanced at the direction of the forest. The dark forest was like a living creature, and the magic in the forest was its countless eyes, and the swaying canopy was like wildly dancing hair. It opened its black bloody mouth, waiting for uninvited guests to barge in. But after a slight delay, the team still headed in the direction of the forest. Through this ruin was the Wall of Sighs, and Brando knew in his heart what was there. But the mana tide came too quickly. Most of the tents were abandoned because there was no time to pack them up. The wind swept them up into the air, but no one dared to look back, and everyone rushed into the forest in front of them against the wind. At this time, someone in the team suddenly let out a cry or two. "Oh my God, what is that?" "Ah!" Brando heard Peya's scream of fear, and he turned his head and saw a team of knights in the forest not far away, emitting a glimmer all over their bodies, slowly moving forward in the forest. He seemed to have seen that team there before. P.S. 14th Happy Valentine's Day. Sob sob sob, it's been a tiring day today. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Calm to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 737. They wore holy white battle robes and silver armor, and held spears and halberds in their hands. The pattern on the spear was a beautiful holy cross, and the halberd was like a sharp spear with a pair of open wings. Below the spear shaft was a swallow-tailed flag, and the flag was painted with a cross, a shining sun, angels, and saints. The flag was written in flowery script, Tientricumri, which meant the holy sword under the light. There were also elves in the team, with pointed ears and long blonde hair tied into braids. Their horses were also dressed in white robes, which were painted with the pattern of sun thorns. The whole team was shrouded in fluorescent white light, moving forward slowly in the forest, but silently, making the scene look very strange. My lord, my lord. Medisa had to pull him twice to get him to come back to his senses. Brando let out a sigh of relief. This was the Holy Knight Regiment of the Grecius Knight Regiment, exactly the same as the one he saw in Amber. No, maybe it was that one. Rosa. Someone in the team let out a scream, and a knight stumbled out of the team. Rosa, Rosa. Where are you going? Stop him. Brando suddenly reacted, but the people next to him were a little slower, and the knight quickly disappeared into the dark forest. The team suddenly became a little restless, and he hurriedly reminded them loudly, don't look over there, it's a fantasy in your heart, it only exists in your memory. Those are the dreams of the nameless, entwined with your dreams. If you are tempted, you will be with them and be replaced by them. In the previous battle, Brando had already established his prestige, and his words made everyone tremble, and the team calmed down a lot. But Brando still saw people slow down, and as long as there was a little confusion in their hearts, they would be swallowed by the forest. Brando quietly asked Maynard to count the number of people, and in just a few minutes, the whole team was missing 7 people. He knew that those people would never come back, and they would wander in the dream that the living would never find, and until they died, their souls would linger here. He sighed. These weak-willed people. Maynard's expression was cold. She pursed her lips, and the outline of her face under her long black hair became clear. Brando turned around and looked at the female knight. He was a little displeased. No one dares to say that they will never waver. Everyone has someone or something important in their heart. It is precisely because of this that they wavered in the face of the beliefs that they should uphold. Hank's fiancée, Rosa, is waiting for him to return. Collins has 2 sons and a daughter, but they can't keep their faith in their loved ones. Maynard's voice trailed off. I chose them because I thought they were the best knight. I thought they could survive and return. Brando was stunned. He suddenly saw that Maynard looked very lonely. Are you angry because of this? No, it's just that I misjudged and harmed them, the female knight replied softly. She gave Brando a cold look and turned to leave. Brando was stunned for a moment until someone patted him on the shoulder. He turned around and saw Faraz' handsome but indecent face. Count, you're really something. You even dared to mess with Lady Maynard. Legend has it that a powerful woman is a rose with thorns, but Lady Maynard must only have thorns and not the fragrance of a rose, the young knight said mysteriously. Brando gave the guy an annoyed look. But I saw that you were still hitting on her a few days ago. Faraz shrugged, without the slightest embarrassment of being exposed, and replied with a serious face, it's because of this that I can deeply understand this. Brando stared at the guy. Because she gave him a good beating. Lorena's voice came from behind. The female knight stepped forward and stabbed her fiancé in the ribs with the hilt of her sword. Then she turned around and asked, Mr. Brando, didn't you notice anything wrong? Brando raised his head and looked around. Of course he noticed, or rather he already knew. The knights were trekking through the forest, parting the thick bushes. But the light around them was darkening at an accelerated rate, as if shrouded in a black fog. At first they could see at least a dozen meters away, but now it seemed so dark that only a few people around them could be seen. What's going on? Faraz asked, scratching his arm and shivering as if he had only just noticed the situation around him. I was just about to talk to you about this. It's a dream. A dream? Lorena was puzzled. Simply put, we're in a dream. This dream is the dream of the nameless people in the forest. They often dream of everything that happened before they died. But this dream is shrouded in the real world, connected to the world in our memories. The nameless people often use this method to lure travelers and get them lost in the forest. No wonder I just saw that little woman I saw on Lionel. Oh, Martha. She's as charming as she was then, with a full. Before Faraz could finish, Lorena gave him a fierce glare. Do you mean to say that this is an illusion, Count? Not entirely. Brando answered as he walked. After the team passed through a dense bush, the woodland seemed to thin out. He saw a flat land appear, and the thick darkness seemed to surge in from all directions. Not far away, the knight seemed to sense that something was wrong and began to stir. Everyone close in. Maynard's voice came from the front. The female knight captain's voice was as firm and cold as ever, like a flag in the darkness. Brando sometimes didn't like her personality, but he had to admit that Maynard was an excellent soldier. Even better than his senior. The open terrain reminded him of a place. After walking for a while, there were indeed uneven pebbles and pebbles on the ground. This was a river bank, and only at the bottom of a valley would there be similar terrain. But he wasn't sure if this was the wall of sighs. You know about dreams, Miss Lorena. Brando turned back and replied, everything in a dream is uncertain. The passage of time in a dream depends on how active your mind is when you're asleep, so now we can't be sure that we've arrived at that place, or how long we've been walking in the forest. We're walking through this dark forest, and everything we see is a dream. Wait, I'm a little confused. Lorena held her forehead. Are you saying that this is a dream now, and that you're in my dream, Count? That's not very good, Feroz replied with jealousy. Of course not, you can think of it as being half asleep and half awake. Brando glanced at the guy. You mean that a large group of us are walking around in the forest, collectively sleepwalking? Brando felt that this guy's analogy was really satisfying. But it had to be said that it was the most appropriate explanation for the current situation, so he could only nod to the two of them. That's great, I'm talking about the beasts in the forest. Brendel, you can imagine the feeling of food being delivered to your doorstep. I bet that even the waiters in the Unicorn and Maiden Inn in Rushted don't have such excellent service. If I wander in this forest until I die, do you think they'll put up a tombstone for me and write "A Friend of the Forest" on it? Maybe even give me a 2,000-pound medal. The medal must be engraved with the emblem of the Unicorn and Maiden Inn to prove that I've selflessly contributed to this forest as an excellent waiter. Shut up. Lorena interrupted Feroz's tirade. Count, is there any danger in this dream? This dream is connected to the dreams of the lost ones when they were alive. If you're confused by them, your soul will stay in this forest forever and never wake up. Then what should we do? Be firm. Brando replied, raising his voice and shouting, everyone stay close to each other. This forest is a dream woven by the lost ones. Be careful, it will pull you into the dreams of the past later. If you don't want to sleep in this forest forever, you just have to remember 2 words, be firm and calm. His voice spread far and wide. The dreams of the lost ones were somewhat similar to the battle of the golden demonic tree. However, this dream was completely different from the dream in the Forbidden Orchard. It truly existed in this world. The dreams of the imitators who had lost their reputation would devour everyone like a giant whirlpool, pulling them to the center. And to escape from these dreams, the only thing to do was to redeem the entire dream world. The darkness was getting thicker and thicker, and Brando gradually could not even see the figures of Lorena and Feroz beside him. From time to time, someone asked in the darkness to continue in that direction. Forward. That was Maynard's answer. But in fact, that direction was meaningless. Brando walked for a while, and it became quieter and quieter, as if even the whistling wind had fallen silent. After a while, there seemed to be the rhythmic chirping of insects again, and melodious music came from afar. It was not the ethereal singing of the legendary elves or fairies, but a human instrument, a wind instrument similar to a trumpet, playing a joyful tune. But the sound was faint, as if it came from a certain direction outside the forest. Brendel blinked a few times and felt the light around him gradually becoming brighter. The woodland had become completely sparse, and in front of him was an open space with lights in the distance, like a small town. He stood alone by the riverbank, stars dotted above his head. The forest was full of beautiful black pines, and the moonlight reflected the gurgling water, like a night after midsummer in Butchie or Chablis. Maynard, Lorena, Feroz, Freya, and the night, everything had disappeared. He froze for a moment, then tried the telepathic connection, but there was no response. Brando then understood. He had fallen asleep. This was his dream. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 738. Somehow, Brando felt that he had seen this forest somewhere before. But it was not surprising. The dream of the lost names was fused with his memory fragments, and the dream itself was full of his personal imprint. He stayed by the river for a while and suddenly remembered. He remembered that when he was a child, there was a park near his home, and the pine trees in the park grew so tall and straight. Brando's heart suddenly pounded. He thought of his childhood, and his parents. They were still young and proud of him. When he was young, he was like all children, full of confidence, thinking that he could carry this burden. But he let them down after all. Brando used to think that such disappointment was because of his own failure. In order to escape, he became addicted to games, but it was not until he met the Blade Master of Erewhon in the dream of the Golden Tree, his grandfather, that he realized how wrong he was. But did he still have a chance to ask for forgiveness? Was Lady Martha willing to give him this chance? Brando looked at the light outside the forest and could not help but press his hand to his heart. He still remembered that every holiday, there would be various celebrations in the park, and his parents would take him as a child to participate in the park activities. He knew that it was just a dream. But standing by the river, it felt like there was a weight of 1,000 pounds under his feet. The evening wind blew, and the trees rustled. At this moment, there was a sudden sound of footsteps in the forest. Brando turned his head slightly, and his heart jumped. Is there someone else? Brando looked back and saw an unexpected person stumbling out of the forest, Prince Heruz. The little prince gasped sharply and looked up at his teacher in surprise, but his eyes soon turned red and glistened with tears. Teacher Brando. I thought I would never find you again. Brando was stunned. Never in his wildest dreams did he expect that this little boy would barge into his dreams. Although the guide said that the dreams of the lost names themselves reflected the fragmentation of their memories, the dream world was filled with the memories of others. In Amber, this was determined based on the player's experience, and sometimes other players would enter another player's dream. But the problem was, this was modern times. Modern times. Modern times. Brando's mind was in a mess. What should he do? It would be terrible if the little prince saw his dream. Although his family did not live in a bustling urban area when he was a child, this small county was not a backward area. How would he explain to Heruz if he saw those reinforced concrete buildings, high-rise buildings, cars, and other messy things? How about knocking Heruz out? He shook his head at once. That was not likely, unless he wanted to murder the little prince here. Since Heruz had entered his dream, it meant that the two of them had the same mission. If the little prince could not save himself, then he could only stay in the dream forever. When Brando thought of this, he froze on the spot. What should we do? That was the only question left in his mind. Teacher. Heruz saw Brando standing motionless by the river, staring straight at him. He could not help but feel a little scared and shrank back slightly. He had never seen Brendel act like this before. Brendel was usually very gentle, and he had never seen him like this before. Although Brando's requirements were a bit strict, Heruz was even stricter under his sister's requirements. On the contrary, most of the time, he was very fond of the gentle count. Ah! Heruz, Brando whispered, deciding to give the little prince a heads-up first. After all, Heruz was young and might be able to get away with it. Heruz responded in a low voice, blushing, panting softly. You know, we are in a dream dash. I know, teacher. I heard what you said just now. You said that we were in the dreams of the lost names, and these dreams are filled with our own memories, the little prince replied seriously like a well-behaved student. He was frightened to be alone in the dark, but when he saw his teacher, he calmed down again. Brando was the hero who saved Ampere Seal, but in his heart, Brando was the hero who saved his sister. This, more than any other reason, was enough to make him trust him. No, please, please forget the last sentence. Brando could not help but groan in his heart. He smiled and said gently, yes, Haruz, but you know, dreams are very weird, so no matter what you see later, don't make a fuss. Don't forget, we are still in a dangerous environment. Brando's smile was uglier than crying in his heart, and he wanted to pull out Halran Gaia and stab himself to death. Haruz blinked, and the half-elf's pointed ears moved slightly. His silver eyes reflected the moonlight, shining brightly, and he nodded seriously, I understand, teacher. In fact, I used to have strange dreams when I was a child. There seemed to be no one else, and the little prince was not as shy as usual. He and Brando had been together for several months, and he was naturally not as shy as he was at the beginning. Brendel heaved a sigh of relief. Come with me. He nodded, turned around, crossed the river, and walked in the direction of the light source in the distant woodland. Haruz held the lion's fang and followed suit. The two passed through a large black pine forest, and the light source ahead was getting brighter and brighter, but it was at this time that Brando suddenly narrowed his eyes and made a slight sound of surprise. He stopped and saw a carriage with its door open not far from the woodland. He glanced back at Haruz, wondering if it was the little prince's dream projection. But the little prince was also looking in that direction in a daze, as if he did not understand what had happened. But Brendel didn't expect the boy to be able to see any clues. He was skilled and daring, so he walked over alone and found that there was no one in the carriage. But there was a pool of glaring blood on the seat, and the smell of blood permeated the woodland, slightly pungent. Teacher. The little prince soon noticed the abnormality in the carriage. Brando raised his hand to signal his student to be quiet. Every detail in the dream was not generated out of thin air. This scene was either a memory of him, or the little prince, or part of the lost dream of the lost ones. It looked like the scene of an assassination, and at the little prince's age, he would certainly remember such a scene and would never fail to recognize it. And he himself did not seem to have similar memories. He thought for a moment, and the only possibility left was that it was part of the lost dream of the lost ones. Brando could not help but pay attention. In this dream, the mission was redemption. Therefore, the lost dream was a very important clue. The legendary lost ones wandered in the Black Forest in order to find their lost selves. Most of them did it because of regret, so the missions in the dream were mostly to make up for regret. He lowered his head and soon found specks of blood around the carriage. Brando immediately followed the bloodstains, and before long, he found his target beside a black pine. It was a dead young man with a dagger in his back. He was stooped and his head hung low, almost resting on his knees. He had long lost his breath of life. When Haruz saw this scene, he could not help but let out a soft sound. Do you know him? Brando looked back and asked. No. The little prince shook his head. Then leave the right to examine the body to me. Brando walked over and lifted the young man's body. The young man still looked very delicate, and the clothes he wore showed his aristocratic status, presumably the heir of a noble family. He first picked up the other party's money bag, but as soon as the bag was in his hand, it turned into dust and passed away. Brendel was slightly taken aback. The walkthrough had mentioned this phenomenon before. Everything in the dream was a remnant memory, and other than the most profound part, most of the other details did not exist. So when he came into contact with it, it turned into nothingness. But it was at this moment that a thin piece of paper fell from the dusty money bag. Brando picked up the piece of paper, but found it blank. He pondered for a moment and understood why. In this scene, the most profound memory of the lost names should be this piece of paper. He firmly remembered this piece of paper, but he could not even remember what was written on it. Brendel checked the young man's body again and found that there were no other valuable clues. But he glanced at the seal ring on the young man's hand and memorized what it looked like. Teacher Brando. The little prince stared at the piece of paper in his hand, somewhat puzzled. This is a clue. But it's not enough for it to remember more. We need to go to the next scene. In this dream, we'll help it trace everything back and let it remember who it really is. Brando also looked at the piece of paper in his hand and then replied. Haruz seemed to understand something. We're going to help it find its name, aren't we, teacher? Something like that. Brando was still very satisfied with his student's comprehension. But since it has already forgotten everything, how can we help it remember everything? It must have wandered in this forest for many years, and even that history has disappeared under the dust. Can we really find the memories it wants from nothing? Haruz frowned, looking a little curious. You remember, it's not a complete memory here, right? There are also memories of you and me. Brando suddenly stopped, wishing he could slap himself. But the words had already been said, and he could only continue with great annoyance. We're examining its dreams, and it's examining our dreams. People's experiences are always similar, and the same scene might be able to evoke its recollection. Only then did Haruz nod and look at his teacher with some admiration. Why are you looking at me like that? Brando felt a little awkward facing a little boy with a flushed face and bright big eyes looking at him. Before Master Fleetwood died, he often told me stories. I don't know if it's disrespectful to think so, but I don't think the master knows as much as you, teacher. This was a good flattery. Brando felt a little lightheaded, especially when he knew that the little prince was actually very simple and would not lie at all. He patted Haruz's head. Everyone has their own specialty. Then he straightened up and breathed a sigh of relief. Once he entered the mission state, those messy thoughts from before faded a lot, and he calmed down. The brightly lit place over there looks like a small town. I think we should be able to find some clues. Let's go together. He looked at the edge of the woodland and asked knowingly. Okay. Haruz nodded heavily with the lion's fang in his arms. Brando put the young man's body away. Although he knew that this was just a dream, he still did so out of respect for the dead. People who had lost their names wandered in the forest all day because of their regret. Legend had it that most of these people were spurned when they were alive. But Brando believed that if a person knew regret, then there was at least a place of purity in his heart. Just for this self-redeeming heart, it was worthy of equal respect. Then the two crossed over here and continued forward. It was only a short distance from the edge of the woodland. If it were in the real world, the young man's body and carriage would have been found soon. But this was a dream, and as Brando said, in the dream, only the existence of memory was pursued. Rationality did not exist here. Light flowed into the forest like milk, outlining long shadows at the edge of the forest. Brando moved in the opposite direction of the light and shadow. He passed through the edge of the forest and suddenly opened up in front of him. But he was slightly stunned. Outside the forest was not the park he had imagined. There were no reinforced concrete buildings, no cars, and no high-rise buildings as he had expected. A classical city lay outside the forest, with a moat and scattered small towns outside the city. The city was brightly lit, and a towering wall cut across it, surrounding the city from far and near. A little closer, a road passed through the forest and led straight to the city gate in the distance. Many tents were set up on both sides of the road. The tents were brightly lit, and outside, there were fruits, vegetables, and wine barrels. There was even a stage set up not far away, and he saw clowns performing on it. The actors sang and danced, and the music was cheerful. It looked like a festival celebration in any part of Erewhon's countryside. But because the contrast was too great, Brando could not help but be stunned for a moment. Until Haruz walked out from behind him, saw the city in the distance, and exclaimed in a daze. "Ah!" Brando knew the meaning of this short exclamation. It was as if he recognized the city. Monsteros. The capital of Erewhon. P.S. There is one more chapter. Wait a moment. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Calm to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 739. What was going on? Whose memory was this? Brando did not have a deep memory of the royal city of Erewhon. In his memory, the royal city's luxurious palaces burned in flames, the city collapsed, and the living creatures were caught in a sea of fire. He could still remember the wails and screams that lingered in his ears at that time. But it was not as cheerful as it was now. Brando glanced at the little prince beside him, thinking that this should be Haru's memory. Princess Griffin and her brother had lived in Monsteros for a long time in history, so he should be familiar with it. This might be a summer celebration in his memory. Brando looked up and saw the constellation Lyra in the southern half of the sky, confirming that this should be a summer night. But he was a little puzzled as to how the little prince's memory was connected to the memory of the lost one. How could the assassination scene in the collapsed dreamscape be associated with such a cheerful dreamscape? Brando kept his composure and continued to walk forward. A lot of people had gathered on the side of the road, all kinds of people, but most of them turned a blind eye to Brando and the little prince. This was normal, everyone's memory was vague about the details, these people existed in the memory, but it was just a glance, and he might not remember what each of them looked like. He took Haru's through these people, paying attention to the details of the celebration. But it was at this moment that a carriage came out of the darkness in the distance. It was a dark noble's four-wheeled carriage that slid by like a ghost. Brando saw the coat of arms on the carriage's wall and could not help but narrow his eyes. "Teacher, that's Viscount Benninger." The little prince also recognized it. It seemed that he still remembered the man who betrayed his sister. He grabbed the corner of Brando's clothes worriedly and reminded him in a low voice. Brando nodded. Haru's was still a little confused. He frowned and said to himself in confusion, "It's strange, Viscount Benninger's coat of arms doesn't have holly leaves on it. I remember that's a decoration that only counts can have. Oh, this is a dream. I forgot again, I'm sorry." These unintentional words made Brando's heart skip a beat. His brows suddenly furrowed. He remembered one detail clearly. Count Bennington. There was indeed such a name in history. After the princess won the war against the North, Erewhon ushered in the hope of peace. Then came the 5 years of the Renaissance. Although there were occasional conflicts with Madara, the timeline still passed smoothly in another period of history. Then came the Second War of the Black Roses. Brando felt a stabbing pain in his heart. After the Battle of the Crimson Valley, the Valkyrie died in battle. The situation was even more disadvantageous for the princess. In order to support her own forces against Duke Arek, the princess summoned Benninger back to Monsteros not long after. At that time, Brando silently recalled. At that time, although Benninger did not inherit the title of Duke Cipher, he was made a count. Oh, right, this celebration. Brando felt a chill run down his spine. He suddenly remembered the origin of this celebration. Erewhon and Iko defeated Madara's army in the Manowir area. At that time, Erewhon and the players' coalition forces seemed to have seized a moment of respite. Princess Griffin invited the envoys of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, hoping that Cruz could help. The Midsummer Festival. The Feast of Scrolls. Time froze at this point in history. Brando suddenly understood that this was not Haru's memory at all, but his own. When Princess Griffin was assassinated, he was personally present that day. Brando suddenly clenched his teeth. History was repeating itself in front of him. Teacher. Haru saw Brando's red and white face and could not help but feel a little strange. Brando took a deep breath and replied, "It's nothing, Haru's dash." He was about to say that they had to find a way to enter the city. But it was at this time that he suddenly felt the piece of paper in his hand slightly hot. He hurriedly picked up the piece of paper. That piece of paper had already changed its appearance. He realized that it was a letter, about the size of his palm. He opened the envelope and an invitation fell out. The words on the invitation were blurry, but one sentence stood out: Viscount Caldell and his fiancée, Miss Bestie, are invited to a banquet. Realization dawned on Brando. So the unnamed one's memory was connected to his own. So that guy was on his way to a banquet and was assassinated on the way. But what he was curious about was what this had to do with his memories afterward. And why was that guy assassinated, and what was he regretting? And there was another problem. Viscount Caldell was the only one in the carriage, and the invitation said that Viscount Caldell and his fiancée were invited to a banquet. Then where was his fiancée? Wait, fiancée. Brendel's movements suddenly froze. Teacher. The little prince naturally noticed Brando's movements. He saw the piece of paper in Brando's hand turn into an envelope and naturally remembered what Brando had said before. Teacher, did it remember something new? Brando was silent and handed the letter to his student. Peruz picked up the light piece of paper and looked at it carefully. Then he paused. Teacher, are we going to the banquet in Viscount Caldell's place? In theory, that should be the requirement of the mission. Brendel carefully recalled all the details in the walkthrough, but the conclusion he came up with was almost the same as the one he had just read. But what about the Viscount's fiancée? Should we find her first? Asked the little prince. That was a possibility. Brando thought for a moment, but he didn't think it was likely. As the Viscount Caldell's fiancée, he suspected that she was the core of the mission. But the key was, according to the characteristics of the unnamed one's collapsed dream, the more deeply remembered something, the earlier it should appear. Just like the piece of paper in his hand. And his fiancée was still nowhere to be seen. Either this so-called fiancée was an insignificant person or she was already dead like the Viscount. But no matter if it was the former or the latter, it was basically impossible to find this so-called Miss Bestie in this dream. I'm afraid it will be very difficult for us to find her, answered Brando. Ah. Then we can only go to the banquet like this. But the etiquette officer said that if a Long River noble like this doesn't bring a female guest, it will invite ridicule. Peruz paused and said worriedly. It's not a matter of ridicule. Brando shook his head. What did the ridicule in the dream have to do with him? He couldn't help but admire the little prince for worrying about this at a time like this. The key was that this invitation was obviously something very important to this Viscount, or he wouldn't have remembered it so clearly. He forgot all the other words on the invitation and only remembered the sentence, inviting Viscount Caldell and his fiancée, Miss Bestie, to the banquet, which showed how important this matter was to him. In other words, according to the settings in Amber, if he couldn't meet this condition, then the rest of the mission was basically out of the question. Brando didn't want to be trapped in this dream for the rest of his life. But what he couldn't help but want to curse was, who was he going to find to pretend to be this godforsaken fiancée, Miss Bestie, in this godforsaken place? In this dream, except for the important characters, almost all the memories were fragile. The people outside were like background and couldn't interact with him and Peruz at all. But he suddenly stopped. Brando's gaze fell on Peruz, Erewhon's little prince, the future king. Peruz was only 12 years old this year. Because he had been practicing swordsmanship for a long time, he was already starting to grow taller. His height just reached his waist. He was a bit like his sister, Princess Griffine. He was born with an adorable face and it was rosy. His silver eyes were always watery and his silky hair was plastered to his forehead, making him look like a weak little girl most of the time. Most importantly, because of his half-elf blood, his body was far less muscular than a human boy's. Instead, he was very slender. Just by standing there, he looked pitiful, as if he could not even stand a gust of wind. His aura was even gentler and quieter than his sister's. Brando hesitated. The evil thoughts in his heart couldn't help but surge out. The little prince seemed to sense something bad and couldn't help but look at him carefully. He asked, "Teacher Brando." Brando raised a finger. With a thought, the seal ring of Viscount Caldell from before appeared in perfect condition on his hand. This was the benefit of the dream. As long as something existed in his, Heureuse and Viscount Caldell's memories, it could be easily copied anywhere. Then he lowered his head and said seriously to the little prince, "Heureuse. Oh. Has anyone ever told you that you're beautiful?" The little prince's face flushed. He held the lion's tooth and stared blankly at his teacher. For a moment, he didn't know what to think. Teacher. It shouldn't be a problem if you change into female clothing, right?" It was a big problem. Heureuse held his sword and shook his head furiously. Then he lowered his head and blushed. The redness almost reached the base of his neck. Brando couldn't help but sigh when he saw this. To be honest, this little prince was more like a girl than his sister. He sighed. To be honest, he also thought that his idea was ridiculous. But there was a faint thrill of pranking him. Besides, this seemed to be the only possible way. "Heureuse," he opened his mouth. "P.S. Lord Lucifer, please take care of this month's souls." "What are you looking at?" "Hurry up and offer your monthly votes and souls to Lord Lucifer. This chapter is called The Return of 10,000 Strong Baboons. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation." Chapter 740. The moonlight was as bright as silver, spilling on the floor. The young prince stood bashfully at the boundary between light and darkness. In the darkness, only his sharp chin, which resembled that of a young girl's, his slender upper body, and the hazy silhouette of his formal dress could be seen. His silver-gray eyes, which resembled gemstones, sparkled in the darkness. He was full of shyness, and his hands were stretched out, awkwardly grabbing the sides of his dress. Although it was only a silhouette in the darkness, Brando was very satisfied. Heureuse hesitated for a moment before slowly walking out. First, it was a pair of silver shoes tied with a bow. Then, it was a long lace dress with a silver hem. Then, it was her petite upper body. She was dressed like a noble princess. The silver dress and the huge bow on her chest revealed her thin collarbones and round shoulders like a little girl's. Her hair had also grown long. Her long hair was tied into a ponytail at the back of her head. There were curly strands of silver hair hanging down from each side of her head. There were also many fluffy silver curls in her ponytail. She looked very elegant. The moonlight sprinkled on him, and the surface of his snow-white skin and silver outfit reflected a faint layer of luster, looking like a holy mountain elf. Heureuse stared at the ground, blushing to his slender neck. His pointed ears trembled a little shyly, and he blinked his big watery eyes gently and slowly. Brando was stunned for a moment. In front of him, there was still the shy little Prince Heureuse, but it was clearly a smaller version of Princess Griffine. No, even Her Royal Highness did not have such a delicate temperament. This temperament was simply complementary to the little prince's female outfit. Brando never dreamed that he would see such a gentle and quiet Princess Griffine. He couldn't help but cough. This. Should I call you Prince Heureuse, or Your Royal Highness? Although this suggestion was made by him, he couldn't help but regret it at this time. Brando himself didn't expect Heureuse to look like this after changing into female clothes. Hopefully, there would be no sequelae. Mr. Brando. Teacher, if you say that again, I'll really get angry. Heureuse frowned and replied angrily. He looked left and right at his outfit, and his face was still a little red. This is just a necessary choice to leave this dream, but not to give teacher a chance to make fun of me. Brando was slightly startled. He didn't expect his little student to be so shy and say such a thing. Even on normal days, the little prince rarely dared to talk back to him. For a moment, he almost thought he was hallucinating, and couldn't help but stare at Heruz strangely. The little prince lowered his head and asked in a low voice, "Ladies can't carry swords at the banquet, right?" Brando nodded. "Then please help me keep the lion's fang, teacher." Heruz handed his sword to Brendel. Brendel then realized that his student did seem to have changed. He took the sword and put it into the dimension cave while asking softly, "Heruz, you look a little like your sister now." "Well, I don't know why I think of my sister." The little prince nodded with a red face, "But teacher is right, people can't always rely on others to live, and to leave this dream, I have to work hard. There are many people in Erewhon who suffer in this way, and compared to them, this is just a small difficulty." Brando's eyes lit up slightly. In fact, he did not spend much time convincing Heruz before. He just told his student about a possibility. Of course, they could spend more time looking for the imaginary fiancé, but the dream of the lost ones was a world of disintegration, and every minute they stayed here, there would be more danger. The lost ones let Heruz enter this dream, perhaps with such considerations in mind. Although he didn't know what the lost ones' plans were, the mission in the dream must be closely related to everyone who entered the dream, and it would never be a mission for one person. So he frankly told Heruz about the dangers and risks, let him choose for himself, and told him that he could bear the same risks with him. In the end, Heruz chose this simple way. He originally thought it was just because of the little prince's weak compromise, but he didn't expect him to have such thoughts in his heart. Brando couldn't help but feel a little gratified. The little prince's blind weakness was almost disappointing, but he didn't expect that there would be a day when he would wake up. Although it made people a little dumbfounded, when the future king of Erewhon talked about how he changed his life, would he say it was because of a woman's dress? But although it was difficult to change one's character in a short time, as long as one had such an understanding in his heart, at least he would slowly become stronger. In history, Heruz had also become independent and married Alara, so in this world, it was not impossible for him to become a real king. All he needed was an opportunity. Brando smiled, "I'm surprised you can say that, but your sister will be very happy." "But I'm sure your sister will be very happy. At least you look like a qualified king now." But would a king wear women's clothes? As a player, it was inevitable that some strange thoughts would appear in Brando's mind. That's because the teacher made me understand that I can fight and win with my own sword." Heruz answered in a small voice, "Actually, I'm very grateful. I don't know if I did the right thing or the wrong thing, but I think that I should choose to face it first." "Well said, it's really gratifying to have a student like you. Since you have such thoughts, then let's face this mission together." Brando reached out his hand. "Actually, I have a feeling that this mission might have something to do with you, Heruz." He frowned slightly, thinking of the eldest princess in Castle Monsteros, and for a moment, he had a strange feeling in his heart. How will history play out this time? It has something to do with me. Brando nodded. "I think Viscount Caldell had his own considerations when he made you dress up like this. Although everything in the dream is bizarre, it's not as if there's no connection between things." The little prince didn't dare to refute and could only make a low sound of agreement. Brando reached out his hand and looked at him. Heruz stilled slightly and also looked at his teacher. Brando sighed, "Put your hand on mine. You don't want people to think that Viscount Caldell is an uncultured and ungentlemanly person, do you?" But. The little prince was dumbfounded. "You're wearing gloves, what are you afraid of? Besides, this is just a dream, what on earth are you thinking about?" "Practice first so you don't get caught," Brando said, staring at his student. This wasn't a lie. In the past, when they did missions, they had disguised themselves as all kinds of people. The players even had a self-mocking saying that the self-cultivation of an actor was a quality that every player had to have. Of course, this was especially true for players like Nightingale. It was common for men to dress up as women, and women to dress up as men. The little prince finally made a sound of agreement and forced himself to put his hand on Brando's hand. Brando didn't react. He was completely in mission mode and carefully inspected the prince's attire. Then he asked, "Do you know what the noble ladies of high society are like?" I think I know a little. Walk a couple of steps for me to see." Peruse blushed and walked a couple of steps shyly. But Brando immediately called out, "Stop." Peruse looked up at him in confusion. Brando couldn't help but shake his head. "Forget it, just walk like you usually do. Actually, you originally looked more like a girl." The little prince paused slightly, then gritted his teeth and glared at his teacher. But Brando didn't care at all. His mind had already flown to the palace in the king's city. In his last life, Prince Peruse should have been at this banquet too. What did he see? Brando faintly felt that his memories, the little prince's memories, and Caldel's memories were all tangled together. There must be a hidden knot here. But to solve this puzzle, he probably had to go to the center of that incident. So after practicing for a while in Holy Maiden's clothing shop, Brando took the little prince out. Because it was a dream, he directly copied Viscount Caldel's carriage and mounted 4 snow-white warhorses, heading straight for the center of the king's city. The carriage passed through the main road of the king's city. Erewhon's old capital, every street of Monsteros, seemed so familiar to Brando at this moment. It was as if as he delved deeper into his memories, everything that had become blurry in the past was gradually becoming clear again. This process was as if he was searching for Viscount Caldel's memories while also mending his own. Brando looked at the familiar shops, fountains, and squares. This route was just like the one he had taken to attend the banquet with his senior sister. The originally blurry details were gradually becoming clear. It was as if he had returned to that period of history. Brando's breathing gradually quickened. He frowned and looked at the lights in the night. His mind seemed to have returned to the day of Erewhon's death. The Valkyrie had died in battle and the entire kingdom was shrouded in grief. But the nobles were still obsessed with sensual pleasures. The bustling palaces and brilliant lights seemed to be the kingdom's last dirge. The lights turned into a sea of fire in Brando's eyes. "Teacher." Peruse turned his head. He noticed that Brando's expression wasn't quite right. Brando finally came back to his senses. He shook his head at his student. To be honest, the little prince now looked like a smaller version of Her Royal Highness. He hesitated and said, "Peruse, you may see something you can't imagine later." "Is it because we're in a dream?" "Something like that, but no matter what happens, you can't be impulsive." The dream world itself was a bizarre but logical world. Its logic is closely connected to memories. There's no point in changing the dream. Our mission is to make up for the regrets in Viscount Caldel's heart. Brando paused. "Do you understand?" Rather than saying this, it was more like he was reminding himself. Of course he understood what happened at the banquet, but he knew he had to restrain his emotions. Because this was a dream, a world of memories. Peruse nodded as if he understood. At this moment, the carriage finally stopped. Brando opened the door. But it was at that moment that his hand froze. He stared blankly at the person standing outside the carriage door. It was as if he was looking at a terrifying nightmare. Maynard, no, it should be said that the woman who looked exactly like the female knight was standing under the carriage. She looked at him, compared him to the piece of paper in her hand, and then looked up with a small smile. "Viscount Caldel, right?" Brando felt as if huge waves had been set off in his heart. "P.S. I'm a little busy today, that's all. I'll just treat the rest as owing, but I won't be able to make it up quickly." My limit now is basically 10,000 a day. I'll make it up if I have any inspiration. Also, when I saw the book reviews from the Taiwan branch yesterday, I'm a little embarrassed. Actually, I didn't stop updating on purpose and then disappear without a word. How should I put it? I feel bad about taking leave all the time, so I might as well hide and not see anyone. I'll be careful in the future. To be continued. If you like this work, you're welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 742. Maynard. Brando calmly covered the prince's mouth and turned to look at the woman under the carriage. Her long ebony hair contrasted with her skin as bright as snow. Her lips were as sharp as rubies, and there was a smile at the corners of her mouth. Her pupils were as black as ink, black and white distinct. The wizard's leather armor wrapped around her perfect figure was as red as fire. That unique and warm smile was so familiar to Brando. It was as if a dusty memory had floated to the surface of the water and rippled. That kind face reappeared in front of him. Brando was about to cry. What's your ID? Is this your first time playing the game? Join my team, Sophie. So cute. Who uses their real name in the game? I'm Allium Japonicum. I'm your senior. Ha, I didn't think there would be such a cute boy in our academy. Brando's heart was like a giant whirlpool with raging waves. But he took a light breath and calmed his surging emotions. I am Viscount Caldell. And you are? He could almost feel his hands trembling slightly. He knew that the memories in front of him had long turned to dust, but he still couldn't help but want to ask how she was doing. Even if it was just a word. He could no longer see his senior from that world. Hello, Mr. Viscount. We're the mercenary group Crimson Travelers. You should have heard of us. Today, we're in charge of security outside Mankinton Palace. You can call me Allium Japonicum. Allium Japonicum smiled and introduced himself. But the past was long gone. Everything he saw now had happened a long time ago. Back then, his senior had still maintained her optimism. The Crimson Travelers had originally symbolized the people who would always move towards the setting sun. Everyone had once agreed to pass through the Black Forest and explore what was on the other side of the world. But everyone's fate was ultimately closely tied to the sorrow of this kingdom. That night, the warm lights of Monstero's homes were just like today. At that time, he and Allium Japonicum Senpai were standing in front of this door. But now, only his senior was left in his memory. After that, the only thing left of Monstero's in his memories was a burning palace in a sea of fire. The team that was once like his home had also fallen apart. Brando nodded at Allium Japonicum. I know you guys. You guys are travelers. Although there were adventurers among the natives, NPCs often referred to players as travelers. This title was very insightful because the players were only passers-by and woned. Although they were involved, everything that happened in this world had nothing to do with them. Oh my, this NPC is quite interesting, Sister Allium Japonicum, a voice interrupted. A young girl with wheat-colored skin, short hair, and dragon-scale armor ran over from somewhere and looked curiously at Brando. Players were so unrestrained, but he didn't know when he had been called an NPC. Brando couldn't help but smile bitterly. Oh my, I'm sorry, I know that I'm being rude, Allium Japonicum Senpai. I'll apologize to him first, Viscount. I'm really sorry, the young girl replied casually. But I might say it again next time. I can't always remember. I'm sorry. No need to be so polite. I know your personality, Miss Black Tea. Brando smiled. He found it very interesting to talk to the companions in his memories. Black Tea was stunned. Her beautiful eyes widened. Wow, I'm actually so famous. She turned around and grabbed Allium Japonicum Senpai. She said with some surprise, "Senpai, did you see that? I'm also a famous person. My 2 months of reputation really didn't go to waste." Brando shook his head. Black Tea was the second in command of the exploration team, but she was truly a person of action. Of course, this was a euphemism. To put it bluntly, she didn't think before doing things. Allium Japonicum Senpai smiled. "All right, Her Highness has been waiting for a long time, Viscount." "Her Highness." "And Miss Bessadine, Her Highness has prepared a private banquet for you." "I'll have Black Tea take you there directly," Allium Japonicum Senpai answered. Brando knew that Princess Griffin couldn't have known Viscount Caldel and Bessadine because Viscount Caldel, as a nameless person, should have died a long time ago. The assassination of Princess Griffin happened at the end of the First Era. At that time, Her Highness naturally wouldn't have had any interactions with this Viscount. The only possibility was that Caldel's dream had overlapped with his again. There were always coincidences in history, which meant that this Viscount might have experienced something similar. Perhaps he had been the confidant of a princess from Erwin's previous dynasty, or perhaps he had been the confidant of a princess from a neighboring duchy. Perhaps he had been assassinated because he had passed on information regarding the princess's safety. Perhaps his regret came from the failure of his mission. Brando let his imagination run wild. But what did this have to do with his fiancée? Why did he choose Hirose to be the one to complete this dream? There were better candidates in the team. With anticipation for the private banquet to come, Brando followed Black Tea through Kinten Palace in Monsteros. Princess Griffin's residence was near a garden in the depths of Kinten Palace. She had been living here alone ever since she returned to Corvado from the Erech province. Kinten Palace had long been abandoned after the Civil War. There were not many people in the large palace, and only a few female officials hurried by occasionally. Black Tea chattered along the way. Brando chatted with her intermittently, so it didn't seem lonely. He had a good relationship with Black Tea in his previous life. He deliberately spoke to her, which made her sigh at the fact that there were NPCs who understood players so well. The private banquet was held in the garden. The three of them quickly arrived. Naturally, Black Tea wasn't qualified to participate in a secret NPC meeting of this level. She took her leave first. Brando saw that she had accepted a mission and gained experience. He couldn't help but sigh. Once upon a time, he had been one of them. But this dream seemed so real, and all the details came from his heart. Brando then led the young prince into the garden. He walked around a hedge of short roses and saw a figure in a pavilion not far away. When Brando saw that figure, his heart skipped a beat. This was the 22nd year of Her Royal Highness' reign. In this year, the eldest princess had long since shed the innocence of a young girl and gained the nobility and elegance of a superior. Princess Griffin stood there like a rose carved out of ice. Her slightly raised chin symbolized the pride of the royal family. Her originally bright eyes had become slender, and the determination in them had become mysterious and wise. The only thing that remained unchanged was her long silver curly hair, which was still draped over her favorite silver dress. She was much taller than the little Princess Brando had seen before. Her forehead could almost reach the tip of his nose, and she didn't have to raise her head to meet his eyes. If Princess Griffin was still a young girl in the First War of the Black Roses, she was now a charming mature woman. She exuded a majestic beauty, high and mighty, demure and at ease. Before noticing Brando and Hirose, the eldest princess, to be exact, Erwin's half-queen, was thinking about something alone. Her most trusted maid stood behind her, motioning Brando and Hirose to stop with her eyes. Princess Griffin raised her head. There was one thing about her that hadn't changed, and that was the bright and sharp look in her eyes. It represented her determination, or what others would call stubbornness. Even to the last moment of her life, she never changed. Being swept by this gaze, Haruz, who had put his hand on Brando's hand, couldn't help but nervously grasp his hand. The little princess lowered her head in fear and murmured subconsciously, "Sister, sister." It was like an instinct in the blood. Even though Princess Griffin had changed a lot, Haruz still recognized at a glance that the strange yet familiar person in front of him was his sister. Although he didn't understand why his sister had become like this. It was as if many years had passed in an instant. Her gaze had become even more unbearable for him to look at. As soon as Brando heard Haruz's voice, he broke out in a cold sweat. He thought the prince had at least become a little braver. He didn't expect him to show his true colors as soon as he saw his sister. "Sister, Mr. Viscount, you're here." But what he didn't expect was that the princess nodded slightly at them and said so. Her voice was soft, like an elf song. Brando froze for a moment before he reacted. The lost names rely on similar scenes in other people's dreams to recall their unbearable past bit by bit. In this dream, Bessidine was Princess Griffin's sister, which meant that Viscount Caldel's fiancée might really be a princess. The Viscount had gradually recovered some fragments of his memory. No wonder he chose Haruz. With Haruz's relationship with Princess Griffin in his dream, it was indeed the most fitting for his memory. But does this guy have no concept of men and women? Brando couldn't help but think to himself. "Mr. Viscount, I took the risk to have you and Bessidine come here today. You should know what I mean, right?" Princess Griffin had already spoken again. Brando looked at the eldest princess strangely. Her words confused him. But fortunately, he knew that this wasn't entirely his memory. The person in charge of this dream was Viscount Caldel, which meant that this dream might be both familiar and unfamiliar to him. With this mental preparation, Brando calmed down a lot. Archduke Aurek will also come tonight. P.S. I'll update a chapter today and resume updating first. It's a bit stuck in the plot, but after discussing it with your Lady Nicole, I finally found some clues. Sob sob. To be continued. If you like this work, you're welcome to vote for it at Cheedian.com. Your support is my greatest motivation. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.